Section 1. The nuclear power plant is poisoning Springfield. The Springfield nuclear power plant has 342 safety violations. Its cooling towers are cracked and patched with chewing gum. Radioactive waste is being dumped directly into the local water supply. There are luminous rats living inside the walls. There is a piece of plutonium on someone's desk being used as a paperweight. And in the basement, behind a door that nobody seems particularly troubled by, there are human skeletons. The show shows you the bones once and moves on. Nobody asks about them. The inspection report gets filed. Burns declines to spend the $56 million it would take to fix any of it. And Springfield keeps drinking the water. That is where we are starting tonight. Because once you understand what the plant has been doing to this town for 3.5 decades, everything else about The Simpsons starts to make a different kind of sense. The plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor on the edge of town. Its cooling towers are visible from most of the residential neighborhoods. It is the primary source of electricity for the entire community, which is why nobody has ever seriously tried to shut it down. The man who owns it, Charles Montgomery Burns, refused to pay for even the most basic repairs when an independent inspection finally documented the scope of the damage. Not because he could not afford it. Burns is a billionaire. He refused because paying for repairs would mean admitting the violations existed, and admitting the violations existed would mean someone might start asking what those violations had already done to the people living downwind of those towers. The violations themselves are not minor paperwork errors. Radioactive waste is being deposited near children's playgrounds. Material that should be contained in specialized storage is sitting on a desk where people work. The cooling towers are held together with chewing gum in at least one documented location. There are rats inside the facility that glow in the dark. These are animals that have been living inside a leaking nuclear plant long enough that their biology has been visibly altered. The show treats this as background detail, a quick visual gag, part of the texture of the Springfield nuclear power plant as a place that is obviously not fine. And in the basement, there are bones, human bones in the lower levels of a working reactor facility. The safety inspection found them. The show acknowledged it with a brief shot. And then the story continued, and the bones became part of the background noise of a town that has developed, over decades, an extraordinary capacity not to look at things. The man responsible for preventing this situation from getting worse is Homer Simpson. Homer's official job title is Safety Inspector. His responsibilities include monitoring operational conditions at the plant and ensuring that it does not constitute a hazard to the surrounding community. He has held this position for the entirety of his adult life. The show's own creator has stated in interviews that Homer has an IQ of approximately 55. He sleeps at his workstation. He eats during meltdown warnings. He has made over 700 documented errors on the job and has never been permanently dismissed. In one episode, he caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen to it. A later episode provides additional context for this. Homer's IQ of 55 is not his actual IQ. It is the IQ produced by a crayon that has been lodged in his brain since childhood, physically pressing against his frontal lobe in a way that has been compromising his cognitive function for his entire life. When a doctor finally removes the crayon, Homer's intelligence surges. He becomes articulate, analytical, capable of complex reasoning. He writes a nuclear safety report so technically accurate that it results in the plant being shut down. Homer Simpson, operating with his brain in a functional state, is the kind of person who would shut down the Springfield nuclear power plant. Which means Homer Simpson, with the crayon in his skull and an IQ of 55, is the kind of person who would not. This is not an accident. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in one episode, the first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the cost to bring the facility up to code and nearly went bankrupt from the estimate. Burns bought the plant back and rehired Homer the same day. A competent safety inspector would shut that facility down within a week. Homer's incompetence is not a flaw in Burns's operation. It is a structural feature of it. The violations continue, the radiation keeps leaking, and the man whose job is to notice is constitutionally incapable of noticing. Now look at what those violations have been doing to Springfield. The three-eyed fish appears in Season 2. A fisherman pulls Blinky from a river near the plant. National news. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it is safe. He chews, he swallows. The cameras are on him the entire time. Something passes across his face during that moment, something the show does not comment on but clearly intends you to register, and then the news cycle moves on. Nobody tests the river independently. Nobody collects water samples from Springfield homes. Nobody asks the obvious question that Blinky raises. If the fish coming out of this water have 3 eyes, what is the water doing to the people drinking it? The answer has been embedded in the show since season 8. In an episode called The Springfield Files, Homer is walking through the woods near town late at night and encounters something he cannot explain. A figure, small, luminous, moving through the trees with an odd, gliding quality. Homer becomes convinced he has seen an alien. The entire town becomes convinced. FBI agents are called in. The episode builds toward a reveal, and when it arrives, it is both funny and genuinely unsettling once you sit with it. The figure in the woods is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with radiation therapy and experimental compounds, that it temporarily causes his body to emit visible light. He glows green afterward. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without the next dose, administered on schedule, he would die. After each session, Burns exits the medical facility in a dazed, peaceful state and wanders through the woods near his plant like a man who has been fundamentally rearranged from the inside. He glows in the dark. This is not a metaphor. Burns is so saturated with radiation and treatment compounds that photons are escaping through his skin. The people of Springfield see this glowing figure moving through the trees near their homes, and their first thought is not the nuclear plant that dominates their horizon. Their first thought is alien from outer space. Something has made the connection between what they are seeing and its obvious cause impossible for them to make. Something has compromised the cognitive process that should take them from glowing figure near nuclear plant to radiation poisoning. An entire town cannot complete a logical sequence that a person encountering this situation for the first time, with no prior exposure to Springfield, would complete almost immediately. That is not eccentricity. That is a symptom. The Simpsons movie removes any remaining ambiguity. Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a critical threshold. The Environmental Protection Agency, functioning within the show's universe as a real federal agency with actual authority, determines that the only proportionate response to Springfield's pollution level is physical containment. A dome is placed over the entire town. The United States government, within the logic of this show, looked at Springfield and concluded that the community was so thoroughly contaminated that it had to be sealed to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. The residents inside the dome are not evacuated. They are sealed in with the contamination. Springfield is classified as an environmental hazard by the federal government. The town is a contamination zone. Every person who has been drinking that water and breathing that air and living under those cooling towers for decades is still inside when the dome goes up. Now look at those residents. Homer Simpson, massive overbite. Eyes that protrude from his skull in a way that human anatomy does not normally produce. 4 fingers on each hand, which is true of every Springfield resident without exception. A skull shape that does not reflect any normal human biological configuration. An IQ that qualifies as a clinical disability. A body that has survived being shot, electrocuted, falling off cliffs, being hit by cars, being caught in explosions, walking through fire, and drowning, in dozens of canonical episodes, without any of these events producing permanent physical damage. His healing rate is not enhanced human resilience. It is something else. And he has spent his entire adult working life in direct physical proximity to an active nuclear reactor core. Marge Simpson. Same bulging eyes, same 4 fingers. Hair that grows straight upward in a rigid architectural structure that she has maintained for 36 years without gravity apparently affecting it. Marge was briefly employed at the Springfield nuclear power plant herself. She was inside the same facility, exposed to the same environment, the same 342 active violations, the same leaking material. Their children were born after both parents had already been living in Springfield's contaminated environment for years. Bart has the spiky hair that holds its shape without product. Lisa has the same overbite. Maggie has the proportions of her siblings. Every Springfield resident, without exception, displays physical characteristics that do not appear in populations unexposed to environmental mutagenic agents. Now here is the detail that makes the radiation theory internally consistent rather than speculative. When guest characters arrive from outside Springfield, they look different, not slightly different, fundamentally different. Their proportions are closer to natural human proportions. Their eyes are normally sized. Their faces follow the actual logic of human anatomy rather than the Springfield variation on it. The show draws outsiders with noticeably more realistic characteristics than it draws Springfield residents. The standard explanation for this is that it is an art style choice, a visual shorthand for distinguishing recurring characters from guests. But within the internal logic of the show, there is an observable physical difference between people who live inside the contamination zone and people who live outside it. The people who have been drinking the water look one way, the people who have not look another way. Even the animals. Santa's little helper has the same bulging eyes as the Simpson family, the same structural deviations from what dogs actually look like. Blinky the fish has 3 eyes. Tiff said's wildlife is demonstrably, visibly altered by the plant's environmental output. The show acknowledges this directly in Blinky's case. Then it builds the rest of its visual world on the implication that the same cause is producing the same effect throughout Springfield's entire biological population, and it trusts that the audience will decide not to ask whether that implication is supposed to mean anything. Burns knows all of this. This is not speculation. The show makes it explicit across multiple episodes without ever quite assembling the pieces into a single statement. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians on permanent retainer. He undergoes those weekly treatments that keep his body operational through what is essentially managed chronic radiation poisoning. Burns does not merely profit from nuclear power. His body requires it. He understands what radiation does to biological organisms at a level of genuine personal intimacy because he has been managing radiation's effects on his own tissue for over a century. He has a pharmaceutical division capable of synthesizing experimental treatments. He has the infrastructure. He has the knowledge. He has been watching what his plant produces in Springfield's population, while simultaneously managing the same contamination in his own body through resources that no ordinary Springfield resident has access to. He knows. He has always known. Springfield is his laboratory. When the crayon is removed from Homer's brain and he sees Springfield clearly for the first time, he writes the safety report and the plant gets shut down. He understands what the plant is. He sees the architecture of his own situation with sudden clarity, and then he has the crayon put back. He chooses the fog over the clarity because clarity in Springfield was unbearable. The show plays this as the saddest possible version of a choice that was never quite a free one. And the question nobody asks is how the crayon got there in the first place. How Homer went through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life, visiting Springfield doctors, receiving checkups at a Springfield medical establishment, and not one of them found a foreign object physically lodged in his skull. Either the medical infrastructure of this town is so thoroughly compromised that it cannot perform basic diagnostic work, or someone in that infrastructure knew the crayon was there and made a professional decision that removing it was not in the interest of the man who controls the town's economy. The radiation theory does not explain one Simpsons mystery. It explains the entire show simultaneously. The characters do not age because their mutated biology has been altered at the cellular level. The town resets after catastrophic events because the population's critical thinking has been compromised by chronic neurological damage. Homer survives things that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that make him nearly indestructible while cognitively devastating him. Burns stays alive because he has spent a century building the infrastructure to manage his own exposure with resources nobody else in the contamination zone has access to. Nobody in Springfield questions any of this because the same source that mutated their biology also compromised the part of their minds responsible for questioning things. Springfield is a contamination zone. Its residents are not eccentric, they are symptomatic. And the nuclear power plant that powers their town, employs their neighbors, and poisons their water is not background scenery. It is the engine that runs everything. Every yellow face, every four-fingered hand, every three-eyed fish, every forgotten catastrophe, every impossible recovery. All of it traces back to the same cracked cooling tower, leaking the same invisible damage into the same water supply, sustaining the same compromised minds that cannot figure out why their fish have an extra eye. The plant is not part of the show. The plant is the show. If you are enjoying this breakdown, drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Section 2. Homer's Coma Theory. Now hold everything you just heard at a slight distance, because there is a theory that does not contradict the radiation argument so much as it contains it inside something larger. A theory that asks whether Springfield's contamination, its mutations, its impossible physics and impossible people are all real, or whether they exist only inside the mind of a man who has not been conscious since April of 1993. This is the Homer Coma Theory. It is the most discussed, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the entire history of this show. The writers have addressed it on the record. The evidence for it is embedded in the architecture of the show itself rather than in isolated details. And once you hear it, it tends to stay with you. Here is where it starts. The 1st of April, 1993. The 18th episode of Season 4. An episode called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. Bart has been playing April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one more elaborate than the last. The escalation concludes when Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop, places it inside an industrial paint shaker, and puts it back in the refrigerator. When Homer opens the can, the explosion is violent enough to put him in the hospital. So far, a standard Simpsons premise. Homer in hospital, family worried, episode resolves. But while Homer is lying in his bed recovering, he reaches across the room toward a vending machine, trying to get a candy bar. The machine tips forward. It falls on him. Homer flatlines. Not in a dream sequence, not as a cutaway gag. Homer Simpson enters a clinically documented coma in a standard, canonical, non-Halloween episode of The Simpsons. The coma lasts 7 weeks. 7 weeks of Homer unconscious in a hospital bed, while machines monitor his vital signs and his family waits in the chairs beside him. Then the episode ends with Homer apparently waking up, Bart confessing tearfully at his bedside, Homer grabbing his son's throat in his characteristic gesture of love expressed as violence. The family laughs. The show continues. Except for one detail buried in the final moments of the episode. Homer is told he lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% permanently destroyed, never coming back. His response to this news is to laugh. He says he does not know why he is laughing. His family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. 32 more seasons of Simpsons follow as though this information had not been placed in the room. The Homer Coma Theory, originally developed by a Reddit user called Hard to Pick a Name, and then expanded and refined by fans over years, proceeds from this detail as its foundation. Homer did not wake up from that coma. The scene where he appears to regain consciousness is the beginning of the dream. Every episode since April 1993, every trip to space and encounter with God and impossible physical survival and visit to every country on Earth is a dream produced by an unconscious man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function, while his family sits beside him. The evidence for this starts with something that critics of the show have noticed and debated for 2 decades without agreeing on an explanation. The tonal shift between the first 4 seasons and everything that came after. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was grounded, not realistic. It was always a cartoon with animated physics and heightened logic. But its storylines dealt with situations that real families encounter. Homer tries to stop drinking. Marge considers whether her marriage is what she wanted. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and has to work through the specific disappointment of discovering that someone she admired is more ordinary than she imagined. Bart faces being held back a year in school, which the show handles as genuinely scary stakes for a 10-year-old. These are domestic situations, emotional situations, situations with recognizable human textures. The show's comedy in that period comes from the gap between the weight people give these situations and the cartoon world they are navigating, not from the situations themselves being absurd. After the coma, the show becomes a completely different thing. Homer goes to space. He is selected by NASA, trained as an astronaut, and launched into orbit. He becomes the leader of a vigilante group. He joins a secret society and is identified as the chosen one based on a birthmark. He discovers his mother is a fugitive radical living off the grid to escape federal charges. He meets God. not in a metaphor. Face to face, in 2 separate episodes, as a real event within the show's universe. He meets multiple sitting presidents. He travels to dozens of countries. He holds more than 100 different jobs over the course of the series. He survives physical trauma that would kill an ordinary person many times over, including events that go well beyond Homer's already improbable resilience in the early seasons. The internet has been arguing about when The Simpsons got bad, or changed, or stopped being what it was for 20 years. Critics point to the escalating absurdity. Longtime fans describe a show that stopped caring whether its stories had emotional weight. Everyone broadly agrees that something changed after the first few seasons, and everyone places that change somewhere in the middle period without being able to pin it precisely. The coma theory says the change can be pinned precisely. The change happened in April 1993, in the episode with the paint shaker and the vending machine. The Simpsons did not get worse after season 4. Homer's brain got worse. And the show follows that deterioration with complete fidelity, episode by episode, season by season, as a man's unconscious mind generates dreams that become progressively more elaborate, more detached from the grounded domestic reality he was living when he went under, more dreamlike in the specific way that dreams generated by a deteriorating brain become dreamlike. Before the coma, the show was about things that actually happened to families. After the coma, the show was about what an unconscious man dreams his life could be. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere called Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God. A real one, within the episode's framing. Homer has decided to stop attending church and spend his Sunday mornings at home instead. He has a vision in which God speaks to him directly, and during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. God says that Homer will one day understand the meaning of life, but not yet. His time is coming, God says. Not yet. 6 months after that conversation, Homer is in a coma. 6 months after a divine entity told him his time was nearly up, Homer's waking life ended. What the show presented as a whimsical theological gag in the season 4 premiere reads, in retrospect, as the show telling you something it could only tell you in the language of a joke. God was not being philosophical. God was counting down, and the count ended on the 1st of April, 1993, when a vending machine fell on a man reaching for a candy bar. The aging problem is where the coma theory is most elegant, and it is worth taking time with because nothing else explains it as simply or as completely. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8 for the same period. Maggie has been 1 year old since the show's premiere. Homer and Marge have not aged physically across 3.5 decades. The show operates on a floating timeline where the present is always the viewer's present, the technology updates and the cultural references update, but the characters remain locked at the ages they were when the show began. The radiation theory proposes that mutated biology has disrupted the normal aging process. The cartoon logic explanation points out that virtually all long-running animated shows use floating timelines because aging characters creates insurmountable continuity problems and eventually ends the show. These are both valid explanations in their respective registers. The coma theory has a simpler answer, and a more affecting one. Nobody ages because they exist inside the memory of a man who lost consciousness in April 1993 and has not regained it. Homer's brain cannot imagine his family older because it does not have the reference material to do so. It only knows them as they were on the day the vending machine fell. Bart was 10, Lisa was 8. Maggie was 1 year old. Marge looked exactly the way she looks in every episode. The unconscious mind generating the dream can only reconstruct these people, using the images it had at the moment of injury. Of course, the children do not age. Of course, Marge does not gray. The dream preserves them exactly as Homer last knew them, because that is the only configuration his brain can work from. Every episode since April 1993 is Homer's unconscious mind running a simulation of his life, using fixed reference material from before the coma. The simulation cannot produce growth or change in the people it is built around because growth and change require new information, and the only new information available to the dreaming brain is whatever bleeds in from outside the hospital room. This explains the celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons. Homer's brain, lying unconscious in Springfield General, is not completely isolated. Sound reaches it. A television left on in the hallway. conversations between nurses or family members at the bedside, music from somewhere down the corridor. The dreaming brain absorbs these acoustic fragments and incorporates them into the simulation because the simulation needs material to keep running, and fragments from the outside world are the only new material available. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield is a name Homer's brain caught drifting through the fog of unconsciousness and built a character around. That is why later seasons have so many guest appearances. The dream is depleting its internal material and compensating by incorporating more and more of what leaks in from the room where his body is lying. The show addressed the coma theory directly in season 34. An episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma and reveals that every outlandish episode was just a dream. The scene was fully animated, fully voiced, designed to look exactly like an actual scene from the show. And then the show said it was a hoax, a fake scene planted by hackers, not real, not canonical, just a piece of fan bait that had nothing to do with the show. But the writers made it. They spent production resources creating a direct response to a fan theory. They showed Homer waking up from a coma and then said that was a joke. They confirmed the theory in a fully realized animated scene and immediately retracted the confirmation by calling it a hoax. There is something in the structure of that denial that mirrors the structure of Springfield itself. The town sees Burns glowing in the woods and calls it an alien rather than radiation. The show animates Homer waking from a coma and calls it a hoax rather than canon. The mechanism is the same in both cases. A thing that would require an uncomfortable explanation gets relabeled as something harmless, and the conversation moves on. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory in 2015 and said simply that it was not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. But the things he did not address are more revealing than the thing he did. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift that occurs with surgical precision at the moment the theory says it should occur. He did not explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show has become progressively more surreal and disconnected from grounded reality with each passing season, in exactly the pattern you would expect from a dreaming brain whose functional capacity is declining over time. He said it was not true. The interviewer moved on. The fans did not. Because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever done. It makes the entire show make sense at once. The aging freeze, the tonal break, the celebrity flood, the escalating impossibility of the plots, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, Homer surviving things that are clearly fatal. All of it is accounted for by a single premise. Homer's body is in a hospital bed. His mind is in Springfield. And his mind cannot kill him because his mind is the one running the story. There is a version of the coma theory that stays with you after the analytical part of it has been processed. If the theory is true, the emotional center of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is something that exists in a different register entirely. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his unconscious mind has been dreaming about for more than 30 years, is simple to the point of being almost painful to look at directly. He wants his family. That is all. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous kid. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone in the evenings when the house is settling. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in one arm. He wants Friday night at the Simpson house, the television and the beer and the ordinary, irreplaceable quality of a life that was not spectacular by any external measure, but was his and was full. And in the coma, he has it. The dream gives him all of it. His family preserved exactly as he knew them. His children never growing up and moving away, and becoming strangers the way children inevitably do. His wife never leaving. His life never reaching the moment of reckoning that all lives eventually reach. The dream is not a nightmare. It is the closest approximation of heaven that a man like Homer would ever think to ask for. Every time Homer survives something impossible, every time the world resets between episodes and everything is fine again, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the simulation stops running, Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed, and whether Marge is still in the chair beside his bed or has made the reasonable human decision to build a life in the 30 years he has been unreachable. It means finding out whether his children are the ages they should be now, which is to say whether they are strangers to him. It means finding out whether anyone is still there at all, or whether, worse than any of those outcomes, he does not wake up. The show will never confirm the coma theory. The people who make it have reasons not to, but it will also never be fully disproven because the evidence is not in details that can be explained away one at a time. It is in the shape of 30 years of television, in the aging freeze, in the tonal break, in the slow drift toward the surreal that tracks exactly with the deterioration of a brain that has been dreaming since 1993. Homer keeps coming home by the end of every episode. The family is always still there. Evergreen Terrace looks exactly as it did when he last saw it, because in the dream, he never had to leave. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Before anyone says Maggie, there are several things about this case that the official resolution never fully addressed. The summer of 1995. The Simpsons attempted something that no animated show had tried before, and most have not tried since. A genuine whodunit mystery, designed with actual clues, promoted through a national contest where viewers could submit their guesses. Fox treated it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special called Springfield's Most Wanted, conducting fictional interviews with Springfield residents as though the shooting were a real unsolved crime. The show was a national puzzle that summer, and millions of people were actively trying to solve it. Burns had earned the hostility. By the end of Part 1, every significant character in Springfield had a documented reason to want him dead. He had stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, eliminating the school's funding. He had financially destroyed Moe's Tavern. He had created a sinkhole that collapsed the Springfield retirement castle. He had injured Santa's little helper. He had fired Smithers, his most loyal employee, for showing a moment of moral hesitation. And then, as his final act of the episode, he had built a mechanical device and used it to block the sun over the entire town so that every resident would be forced to purchase their electricity from his plant around the clock at whatever rate he chose. When Smithers protested that this was going too far, Burns fired him on the spot. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront him. The tension was real. Multiple characters were shown with weapons. Multiple characters had specific, documented grievances that went back years. And then Burns was shot. Single wound. He staggered to the town sundial, fell, and his hands landed on two letters, W and S, from one angle. From Burns's own perspective as he fell, M and S. He was rushed to hospital. The screen went black. America had an entire summer to think about it. The resolution, when it aired in September, was a comedic procedural. Wiggum and the Springfield police fumbled through eliminating suspects. Smithers confessed immediately, which seemed to end the mystery before it began, but his confession collapsed when it became clear he had been in a complete blackout at the time of the shooting and had actually discharged his weapon against a different person at a different location that night. He shot old Jasper in the wooden leg. Different crime, different victim, different night. Smithers was eliminated. Principal Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente had what the episode treats as the greatest alibi in television history, a complete musical number in which he explains that he channeled his rage into the composition of a samba. The investigation stalled until forensic analysis of Burns's suit found a physical clue, an eyelash. DNA matched it to a Simpson. Homer was arrested and on the verge of conviction when Burns woke up and identified Maggie as the shooter. According to Burns, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the meeting. He reached for her lollipop. His gun fell from its holster during the struggle. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Except the case was filed rather than solved, and in Springfield, those are two different things. Begin with the contest. Fox ran the competition, promised the winner would be animated into a future episode, and received thousands of entries. According to DVD commentary produced by the show's own creators, not a single person in the randomly selected pool of entries correctly identified Maggie as the shooter. The prize was awarded to someone with the wrong answer, who received a cash payment instead of the animated appearance because they had not solved the mystery. The commentary also acknowledges that one person, posting on a Simpsons news group on the night the original episode aired, did get the correct answer. This person was using a college internet account. By the time the contest ended and producers tried to locate them, the account was deactivated. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for that person to come forward. As far as anyone can determine, they never did. The show's creators designed a mystery, told the public it was solvable from the evidence in Part 1, built a national promotion around it, and when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody had derived it from the clues. That leaves three explanations. The clues were insufficient for the answer to be reached from them. The red herrings were so effective they overwhelmed any legitimate trail. Or, the answer did not logically follow from the evidence in the way the show implied it would, meaning the mystery was reverse engineered from a conclusion rather than constructed to point toward one. Now consider the specific evidence. Burns falls on the sundial. His hands point to W and S, or from his own perspective, M and S. The show presents this as the key clue pointing toward Maggie Simpson. But Burns himself, in canonical dialogue within the episode, stated that his hands landing on those letters was not intentional. He was falling. His hands ended up where they ended up by chance. The central piece of evidence used to support the resolution was explicitly described by the victim as a coincidence: the gun. Burns was carrying a weapon in a holster. In scenes leading up to the shooting, the holster is shown empty. The gun was already missing from his person before he was shot. The shooter used Burns's own weapon against him, which means they did not arrive at the meeting armed. They found or took the gun in the moment, during the confrontation, or in the parking lot afterward. This fits a baby who stumbled across a dropped weapon. It also fits any adult who did not come to the meeting armed and encountered the gun in the chaos. Burns's last words at the moment of the shooting. The show establishes that his final words before being shot were a calm recognition, something expressing that he knew who was in front of him. Not alarm, not surprise. The casual acknowledgement you give to someone you have encountered before, someone whose presence you do not perceive as threatening. Does Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? The show does not establish any prior relationship or meaningful interaction between Burns and Maggie before this episode. Burns famously cannot remember Homer's name, after years of Homer working for him. The idea that Burns would see an infant in a parking lot and respond with relaxed recognition, as though greeting a familiar acquaintance, does not fit what the show has established about him. In Season 18, Homer mentions in passing that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it casually, on camera, and nobody reacts. No investigation, no moment where anyone around him processes what he just said. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the most powerful man in Springfield, and the scene continues as though he made an unremarkable comment about what is for dinner. Either Homer is making a joke or lying for attention, which, given his character, is entirely plausible, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer made an offhand confession that nobody took seriously because Springfield has agreed, implicitly and collectively, not to revisit what happened that night. The most sustained alternate theory centers on Marge. The argument for Marge as the real shooter has several components. She watched Burns destroy her children's school. She watched him injure her family's dog. She watched him steal sunlight from her town, literally and physically, not as a metaphor. She watched the community she has been the emotional center of be stripped of something fundamental by a man who could do it and suffer no consequence. Marge's patience has a threshold. The show has depicted that threshold being reached in other contexts. If there was ever a night that threshold would break, it was the night Burns blocked the sun while simultaneously firing the one person who had ever shown any loyalty to him. The theory also accounts for Burns's behavior after the shooting. An earlier episode established that Burns had developed a complicated infatuation with Marge, pursuing her with the specific persistence of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted. The infatuation was unrequited and resolved, but it established that Burns has feelings about Marge that go beyond his usual view of Springfield's residents as interchangeable resources. Under this reading, Burns recognized Marge in the parking lot. His last words were directed at her specifically, and when he woke from his coma, he chose not to name her. He let the investigation reach its own conclusions. He looked at his hands on the sundial and said nothing to correct what Springfield decided those letters meant. Maggie was convenient as the answer, in a way that no adult suspect could be. Chief Wiggum says it directly in the episode. No jury would convict a baby. Maggie could be the answer without anyone being punished, without the case going to trial, without Burns ever having to explain the parking lot from his own perspective. She was the resolution that closed the file without creating new problems. The alternate ending is itself evidence that the official answer was not predetermined. The show produced a complete, fully animated, fully voiced alternate conclusion in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. This alternate ending was shown in a later clip show, dismissed as wrong, explained away with a joke that included a deliberate reference to the O.J. Simpson trial and a jury ignoring DNA evidence. The show was pointing at itself. It was saying that official verdicts and actual truths are not always the same thing, embedding this observation inside a segment explicitly about the Burns shooting. The writers also had Barney Gumble as the shooter in an early draft of the script. They cycled through multiple serious candidates before settling on Maggie. The clues in Part 1 were adjusted to fit whatever answer was eventually chosen rather than designed from the beginning to point toward a predetermined solution. The mystery was built backward. The final shot of the resolution episode shows Maggie alone in the hospital room after everyone else has left. She checks to confirm nobody is watching. Then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show intends this as confirmation of guilt, but watch it without that framing. Watch it as what it could also be. A baby who witnessed something violent, alone in a quiet room, doing what children do with things they have seen, replaying it. Imitating the gesture not because she made it, but because she watched someone else make it and is still processing what that means. Babies imitate. That is not confession. That is development. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The DVD commentary treats it as settled. The writers stand behind it. But the contest nobody won, the clues that Burns himself called coincidental, the alternate endings that were fully produced, the season 18 confession that the show never followed up on, the question of how Burns would calmly recognize an infant he had never meaningfully interacted with, all of it together suggests that the greatest mystery in the history of this show was not solved. It was filed. And in Springfield, those are not the same thing. Section 4. How is Mr. Burns still alive? This is not a rhetorical question. Within the established internal logic of The Simpsons, within the rules the show itself has set up and repeatedly confirmed across hundreds of episodes, Charles Montgomery Burns is medically impossible. Not in the general way that cartoon characters are impossible, in a documented, specific, within-universe way that the show has gone out of its way to establish and then consistently refuse to explain. Burns's age has been implied, stated, and quietly contradicted many times. The show never commits to a precise birth year, but every version of the timeline, read charitably, places his birth in the late 19th century. He has described personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century as recent experiences. He has told stories about events from the 1910s in the first person, with the kind of sensory detail that only comes from having been present. He has mentioned working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. By the most conservative reading, Burns is well over 100 years old, and he runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Not nominally, not ceremonially. He runs it actively, strategically, with sustained cognitive effort that requires current knowledge of modern finance and modern law. His body is frail. His physical strength is negligible. The show uses this as a running joke, but his mind is sharp in a specific way. Strategically, Burns almost always gets what he wants. He outmaneuvers people who are younger and physically stronger than him because he thinks further ahead than they do. He is the most consistently effective agent in Springfield, operating at that level across the entirety of a lifespan that should have ended before most of the country's current infrastructure was built. The show provides a specific explanation for how this is possible in the Springfield Files. As discussed in the first section, Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive that it temporarily causes his body to emit visible light. He glows green. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly one more week. Without the next dose, administered on schedule, Burns dies. His survival is not biological, it is logistical. It depends entirely on the weekly intervention being administered without interruption. This is not a throwaway detail. The show establishes it as the actual mechanism of Burns's continued existence, a process that has to be managed with zero tolerance for missed appointments, involving radiation, administered weekly, indefinitely. Burns is not aging slowly and surviving through good fortune. He is being kept alive through scheduled maintenance. His life is infrastructure. The treatment involves radiation because of course it does. The man whose power plant has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's water supply for decades is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure for his own biological function. Burns does not merely profit from nuclear power. His body requires it. His cells have been so fundamentally altered by over a century of proximity to nuclear material and experimental pharmaceutical intervention that they can no longer sustain themselves through ordinary biological processes. He needs external radiation input the way a normal person needs food and water. Take the treatment away and the system fails within a week. This connects to the most famous medical scene in the series. Burns visits a doctor for a routine checkup and receives a diagnosis that should be biologically impossible. He has every disease known to medical science, all of them simultaneously present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains that the diseases exist in perfect equilibrium. Each one competes with all the others for biological dominance. Each one cancels out all the others. None of them can progress because they are all equally matched in a continuous 4-way, 8-way, 100-way standoff that prevents any single disease from gaining the foothold it would need to kill him. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome, comparing it to three people trying to walk through a doorway simultaneously. None of them can move. Burns is the sickest man in America and is, as a consequence of being the sickest man in America, functionally indestructible. The weekly radiation treatments maintain this equilibrium. They are not curing anything. Burns is not being treated in the conventional medical sense. His treatments hold every disease in stasis, balanced against every other disease, preventing any single condition from gaining the upper hand. Remove the treatments and the balance collapses. Every illness surges simultaneously. The gridlock breaks. This is why the margin for error is zero. This is why missing a single dose is fatal. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the control rods. Smithers is not simply a devoted assistant. Smithers is a medical necessity. Smithers manages Burns's schedule with a vigilance that the show has consistently depicted as bordering on obsession. He ensures that Burns attends every weekly treatment. He monitors Burns's physical condition continuously. The show has established across many episodes that if Smithers were removed from his position, Burns would be physically helpless within days. Without someone managing the logistics of his medical protocol, Burns would miss a dose. The equilibrium would collapse. The diseases would surge. Smithers's devotion to Burns is not only the product of the complicated personal feelings the show has explored at length. It is also structural. Smithers has understood, at some level, that his continued presence is the technical requirement keeping Burns functional. His loyalty is not just psychological. It is load-bearing. And the knowledge that his absence is a death sentence sits underneath everything in their relationship, giving it a weight that explains its particular intensity. Burns has also placed himself in proximity to a remarkable span of documented American history. He attended Yale. He served in some capacity during the Second World War, in a role the show describes with deliberate moral ambiguity. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the wartime period and kept it for decades. He has described the Gilded Age, the period of enormous industrial wealth in the late 19th century, as personal experience rather than historical knowledge. His family's wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns dynasty extends back to a period of American history when the country was still establishing the basic shape of its institutions. The question the show never addresses is whether Burns is unique in his approach to longevity, or whether his family has always found methods to extend their hold on power beyond what natural human lifespans would allow. The family has maintained continuous control of its fortune across multiple generations, through wars and economic collapses, and the natural attrition that normally disperses generational wealth. That kind of continuity requires either extraordinary luck sustained across a very long time, or extraordinary measures applied to the problem of keeping power in the same hands. Before nuclear technology provided the specific mechanism Burns currently relies on, the family needed something else. The show does not say what, but it establishes that the need was there. Burns's relationship with death itself is particular. He has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the show's run, and each time, something intervenes. He was shot and survived. He has been hospitalized dozens of times for injuries and conditions that should have been fatal given his age and the known state of his body. He has been attacked, abandoned in wilderness, poisoned, and collapsed. Each time, infrastructure mobilizes around him. Money, resources, the machinery of accumulated wealth, ensuring there is always someone standing by with whatever it takes to bring him back. Homer survives things because the show needs him to. It is a passive survival, something the narrative does for him. Burns survives through architecture. Every dollar he has accumulated, every institution he has corrupted, every politician he has purchased, every doctor he has retained on permanent call, all of it ultimately serves the function of ensuring that the system keeps running long enough to administer the next dose. His survival is not passive, it is engineered. And it has been engineered across more than a century of deliberate, focused, resource-intensive effort. If Burns dies, his empire begins to disassemble, and empires that have been maintained as long as this one develop powerful instincts for their own perpetuation. But the most unsettling thing about Burns's immortality is not personal, it is structural. Springfield needs him to stay alive. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant operates because Burns runs it. Burns runs it because the treatments keep him functional. The treatments depend on the wealth the plant generates. It is a closed loop with no exit point. Springfield cannot challenge Burns because Springfield's economic survival depends on the plant continuing to operate, which depends on Burns continuing to direct it, which depends on the treatments continuing to be administered. The residents cannot advocate for their own health because the income that allows them to feed their families depends on the facility that is slowly altering their biology. Burns is too expensive to die. Springfield will keep paying whatever his continued existence costs because the alternative is a reckoning the town does not have the cognitive or economic resources to survive. He is the oldest man in Springfield, possibly among the oldest men in the country, kept alive by weekly radiation treatments, sustained by a fortune that predates the nation itself, maintained by an assistant whose loyalty is a technical requirement, surrounded by a population whose capacity to question him has been compromised by the same contamination he produces. He is not immortal. He is something more durable than immortal. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying that bill for as long as he can keep the lights on, which, given his current treatment schedule, may be indefinitely. The question that the show plants and then carefully never asks out loud is a simple one. If you took every documented effect of the plant's violations and traced them forward in time, what would you expect to find in Springfield's population 20-30 years later? The answer is not hypothetical. The show has been providing it continuously, in every frame, in every character design, in every moment where the physics of Homer's body exceed what human biology allows. Consider the specific nature of the contamination the show documents. Radioactive material dumped into waterways does not stay in the water. It enters the food chain. Fish absorb it. Humans eat the fish. Groundwater carries it into wells and municipal water systems. Rain spreads it through soil. It accumulates in bone tissue, in fat cells, in organs, in the brain. Radiation exposure does not produce immediate dramatic symptoms in most cases. It produces changes that unfold across years and generations. It produces mutations that are sometimes visible and sometimes not. It produces cognitive changes that can be difficult to separate from ordinary human variation unless you have a baseline for comparison. Springfield has no baseline for comparison. Springfield is the baseline. Everyone in town is drinking the same water and breathing the same air and living in the same shadow. They have nothing to measure themselves against except each other, and everyone else looks like them. And so, the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the bulging eyes and the impossible healing rate are simply what people look like. They are the normal. The mutation is the normal. And a population for whom the mutation is the normal has no mechanism to recognize it as a mutation. This is not a criticism of Springfield's residents. This is a description of how environmental contamination actually works in real communities. People who grow up near contaminated sites often have elevated rates of conditions that are difficult to attribute to any single cause. Cancer rates, birth defect rates, cognitive development differences, neurological conditions. The contamination is diffuse and accumulates slowly, and its effects are masked by the noise of ordinary human biological variation. The people who live near the contamination are often the last to recognize it because they are inside the effect they would need to step outside of to perceive accurately. Springfield is that mechanism operating in a cartoon, and the show makes it legible in a way that real contamination rarely is because it externalizes the effects visually. You can see the four fingers. You can see the yellow skin. You can see Blinky's third eye. The show shows you the contamination's effects with the directness that real contamination almost never has, and then it asks you to decide whether you are going to process what you are seeing or absorb it as set dressing. Most viewers absorb it as set dressing. They are doing exactly what Springfield's residents do. Burns' management of his own exposure is the most revealing element of the entire structure because it demonstrates that the contamination's effects are understood by someone with both the knowledge and the resources to manage them. Burns does not merely tolerate the contamination. He has built an entire medical apparatus around managing it. The weekly treatments, the private physicians, the pharmaceutical division, the complex biological equilibrium that the treatments maintain, all of this represents decades of research and infrastructure specifically designed to handle what prolonged radiation exposure does to a human body. Burns knows. He has always known. He has been watching the same contamination that is altering Springfield's population work its effects on his own tissue, and managing those effects with resources the rest of the town cannot access. The implication is that the treatments Burns receives could, in principle, be provided to Springfield's residents. That the cognitive and biological damage accumulating in Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and every person who drinks the water could be managed or mitigated if the same resources were applied to them. Burns has been managing his own contamination for over a century. He has the pharmaceutical infrastructure and the medical knowledge to provide some version of that management to others. He chooses not to. He chooses to let the contamination accumulate in the population that lives around his plant while managing his own exposure exclusively, because a population whose cognitive function is compromised is a population that cannot effectively challenge the source of that compromise. The contamination is not merely a side effect of Burns's operations. It is a feature of them. It produces the exact population he needs to maintain his monopoly indefinitely. The human skeletons in the basement are worth returning to because they represent the show's most direct statement about what happens when the contamination cannot be managed. Burns has treatments. He has resources. He has the pharmaceutical infrastructure to sustain a biological equilibrium that keeps him alive through a disease load that should have killed him many times over. The people in the basement had none of that. They worked in the facility. They were exposed to whatever the facility exposes people to at close range. And something happened to them that left their remains in the basement of a working nuclear plant, unreported, unacknowledged, absorbed into the background noise of a facility with 342 other violations that also went unaddressed. The show does not tell you who they were. It does not need to. The bones speak for themselves. They are Springfield's future if the contamination were suddenly concentrated, if the slow, diffuse poisoning were compressed into something acute, if the buffering effect of the water supply and the air and the gradual accumulation were replaced by direct exposure. The bones are what happens to people who encounter what the plant is leaking without the buffer of distance and time and without the resources Burns uses to manage his own exposure. And the safety inspector who is supposed to prevent this from expanding looks at the bones and reaches for a donut. The mechanism by which the coma theory accounts for the show's celebrity appearances deserves more careful attention than it typically receives, because it illuminates something specific about how the dream works and how the dream changes over time. In the early seasons, guest appearances in The Simpsons were relatively rare and generally functional. A celebrity voice would appear as a character who served a specific narrative purpose within the episode. The guest was integrated into the story rather than being a walking cameo. This reflects the show's approach in its pre-coma period, where storytelling was the primary objective and celebrity appearances served the story. After the coma, the approach shifts. Guest appearances become more frequent, then significantly more frequent, and they become increasingly disconnected from narrative necessity. Celebrities appear as themselves in Springfield with less and less justification for why Springfield specifically would be the place they end up. The show starts to feel, at a certain point, like a machine for running famous people through a specific setting rather than a machine for telling stories. The celebrities are the point rather than a resource the stories use. Under the coma theory, this progression makes sense in a specific way. Homer's brain, lying in the hospital, is receiving external information at whatever rate the environment provides it. In the early stages of the coma, the dream runs primarily on internal material, on Homer's existing memories, and the emotional architecture of his pre-coma life. The early post-coma seasons are dreamlike, in the sense of being more fantastical than the pre-coma seasons, but they still carry significant emotional weight from the character relationships Homer had established. The stories feel grounded in the people even when the events are surreal, because Homer's memory of those people was rich and specific. As time passes, as the brain's functional capacity diminishes, the internal material becomes less generative. The dream needs input to keep producing new content, and the only new input available is the ambient sound of the world outside the hospital room. Television, conversations, music from a radio, names and voices drifting in. The brain processes these and builds around them, generating dream figures that resemble the source material in whatever ways the dreaming mind can manage. The celebrities are not the show choosing to have more celebrity cameos. They are Homer's brain incorporating fragments of external media into a simulation that is running low on its own material. The reason the celebrity episodes of later seasons often feel oddly disconnected from the emotional core of the show is that they were not generated from Homer's stored emotional knowledge of the people they depict. They were generated from ambient input, from whatever the dreaming brain caught through the hospital room wall and built into something that could participate in the simulation. The emotional depth is thin because the source material was thin. A name heard from a television, a voice from a radio, a fragment of a celebrity's public persona that the brain assembled into a dream character without the full weight of genuine relationship behind it. This also explains why the emotional resonance of the later seasons is so different from the early ones, even when individual episodes are technically well crafted. The early episodes were built from Homer's actual memory of his actual life, however distorted by the coma. The later episodes are built from something more like noise. The dream is still running, but it is running on fumes, on fragments, on whatever it can catch. The 5% brain function loss is the number the show puts on record as the official cost of the coma. 5% is not a catastrophic reduction. It does not render Homer immediately unrecognizable. It does not produce a dramatic change that everyone around him would immediately notice. It produces a gradual shift in the kind of person the dream generates. A slow drift towards something less grounded, less emotionally specific, more driven by spectacle and guest appearances and plots that the pre-coma Homer would not have been capable of experiencing. 5% every few years compounds. A brain that loses some portion of its remaining function continuously over 30 years is a different entity at the end of that process than it was at the beginning. The Homer of season 28 is not the Homer of season 5, and the difference is not simply that the writers have made different choices. Under the coma theory, it is that the mind generating the simulation has substantially less capacity than it had when the simulation began. The dream is degrading. The signal is weaker. What comes through is more fragmentary, more disconnected from the emotional bedrock that made the early seasons feel like they were about something real. The show is, in this reading, a record of a brain dying slowly, told from the inside. There is one more element of the coma theory that does not get discussed often enough, because it moves the conversation from analytical to something more uncomfortable. If the theory is true, then Homer's family knows. Not necessarily that Homer is dreaming, but that Homer is in a coma. They are sitting in the chairs beside his bed. They are there when the machines make sounds. They are there for the conversations with the doctors about prognosis and brain function and what 5% permanently gone actually means for long-term recovery. They are living through whatever is actually happening in the room where Homer's body lies, while Homer's mind runs its simulation. The family that Homer is dreaming about, the Marge and the Bart and the Lisa and the Maggie who exist in the dream as the people he loves most, those versions of them do not know any of this. They are part of the dream. They are not experiencing the hospital room. They are experiencing Evergreen Terrace and Springfield and all the adventures that Homer's unconscious generates for them, and in the dream they are the happy or frustrated or complicated family they have always been. But the real versions, the ones in the chairs, they are doing something the dream cannot show. They are waiting. They are deciding over and over how long to wait. They are aging in the room where Homer is not aging. They are growing into the people that Homer's dream keeps them from becoming, because the dream cannot see it happening. And the Marge in the chair, the real Marge, is not the Marge in the dream. She is older. She has been making decisions Homer does not know about. She has been living a life that the dream cannot reach. And every time the dream Marge turns to Homer with warmth and exasperation and the particular love that the show has always depicted between them, the real Marge in the chair is doing something else entirely. The coma theory makes the show unbearably sad in a very specific way. Every moment of warmth between Homer and Marge, every moment where the family is together and things are okay, every moment where Homer comes home and the house is lit up and the children are there, is a moment that Homer is not actually experiencing. It is a moment he is generating in the dark, from memory, because the real version of it is inaccessible to him. The dream is not a tragedy. It is the only thing that makes the tragedy survivable, which may be why in the end it keeps running. Not because the brain refuses to wake up, because the dream is the only place where everything is still okay. The question of what Burns' last words actually indicate is worth more careful examination than it typically receives in discussions of the mystery. The show establishes, through dramatic convention and through the specific framing of the shooting's aftermath, that Burns said something at the moment of the attack that indicated recognition of the person in front of him. The familiarity of that recognition, the absence of alarm or surprise, the specific quality of seeing someone you have encountered before rather than confronting someone unexpected, is one of the most specific clues the episode provides. And it is a clue that points away from Maggie with particular force. Burns' cognitive relationship with infants in Springfield is not one of familiarity. Burns' cognitive relationship with most Springfield residents is one of contemptuous indifference. He does not distinguish between them with any precision. They are the population that lives near his plant and purchases his electricity. They are not individually people whose faces he has stored with any particular attention. The man cannot remember Homer's name after years of Homer working for him. Homer is in his building daily. Homer is on his payroll. Homer's name appears on official documents that pass across Burns' desk, and Burns reliably does not know it. An infant whom Burns has never employed, never had business dealings with, never encountered in any meaningful social context, would not register in Burns' mind as someone he recognizes, with the calm familiarity that, "Oh, it's you," implies. The line is not a surprised acknowledgement. It is not even a neutral acknowledgement. It carries the particular flatness of seeing someone you expected to see eventually, as though the encounter is unsurprising rather than random. If Burns did not expect to encounter Maggie Simpson in a parking lot, he would not produce a response that sounds like he did. The line is a clue. The show put it there with intention, and the person it describes is someone Burns has a specific, personal, complicated history with. Someone whose reappearance in a parking lot after a heated town meeting, carrying his own gun that had somehow gone missing, might produce exactly the specific quality of recognition the line conveys. Marge fits that description. Homer, in a different way, also fits it. Smithers, despite his official elimination from consideration, fits it in the sense that Burns' last words to someone who had been his most loyal employee for decades might carry a particular weight of recognition. But consider the structural argument for Marge one more time. After Maud's death, Ned Flanders forgave Homer. This was presented by the show as Ned's defining act of grace, the central expression of his character's commitment to genuine Christian forgiveness over human resentment. The show gave that moment enormous weight. It positioned Ned's forgiveness as the moral climax of the storyline. And then, the show moved on. Marge never had a parallel moment with Burns. The show never staged a scene where Marge confronted her feelings about what Burns had done to her children's school, to her community, to the town she has always been the quiet, emotional center of. Marge's relationship with Burns after the shooting is simply absent from the show's explicit content, which is either an oversight or a deliberate choice not to create evidence that might point in a direction the show wanted to keep ambiguous. The absence of a confrontation scene, the absence of a resolution scene, the absence of any direct acknowledgement by Marge of Burns as the person who stole sunlight from her town and impoverished its schools is conspicuous once you notice it. The show stages Ned's forgiveness of Homer explicitly because Ned's character requires that moment. The show does not stage Marge's relationship with Burns because Marge's character and what happened in that parking lot requires that it not be staged. This is the kind of narrative gap that is easier to explain by deliberate omission than by accident. The show is not careless about its character work. When a major character has a major unresolved situation with another major character, the show finds a way to address it. That it does not address Marge and Burns' relationship directly, despite Marge having strong documented reasons to feel strongly about Burns, suggests that the relationship cannot be addressed directly without creating problems for the show's official narrative about who did the shooting. The Three Stooges syndrome scene deserves expansion beyond what most discussions give it, because it contains a specific medical impossibility that becomes explicable only within the framework of Burns' radiation treatments. And that impossibility in turn reveals something significant about the nature of his situation. The condition the doctor describes is not merely a colorful medical metaphor. It is a precise description of a system that has achieved a kind of accidental stability through the mutual cancellation of its destabilizing elements. Every disease Burns carries has, in theory, the capacity to kill him. Each one is present and active in his body, but each one is also blocked by all the others. The diseases are not dormant. They are not latent. They are competing continuously, consuming the biological resources they need to progress, and failing to progress because every disease is in the same competition simultaneously. This equilibrium would not occur naturally. Diseases do not normally balance each other this precisely. A body carrying every known disease would not achieve perfect mutual cancellation. One disease would eventually gain marginal dominance over the others and break the equilibrium. The equilibrium the doctor describes is not the product of natural biological luck. It is being maintained by something external to the natural disease processes. The weekly radiation treatments are that something. The treatments do not cure anything. They do not eliminate any of the diseases. What they do is introduce a controlled input that maintains the precise chemical and biological conditions under which the equilibrium holds. Burns' treatments are not therapy in the medical sense of working toward a cure. They are calibration. They adjust the internal environment of his body to keep every disease in its current position, preventing any single pathogen from gaining the advantage it needs to progress. This means that the treatments themselves must be extraordinarily precise. The calibration that maintains every disease in perfect stasis requires detailed knowledge of how each disease in Burns' body is currently distributed and what biological conditions are required to keep each one from progressing. A treatment that is slightly off would tip the balance, allowing one disease to gain ground. A treatment that is missed entirely would allow the equilibrium to begin collapsing as the diseases, freed from the calibrating input, begin their natural competition toward dominance. This is why the margin for error is zero. It is not simply that Burns needs treatment to survive. It is that the specific calibrated treatment, administered at the specific correct time, is the only thing standing between the current equilibrium and total systemic collapse. Any deviation from the protocol is potentially catastrophic. Any missed dose is potentially fatal. The precision required is not the precision of a medical treatment. It is the precision of a control system. Burns' body is a closed system that has been brought to a point of managed stability through external intervention, and that stability is maintained only by the continuous, precise application of that intervention. Remove the intervention and the system fails. Adjust the intervention incorrectly and the system fails. The only sustainable state is continuous, exact maintenance. Smithers is the human component of the control system. He manages the schedule. He ensures the protocol is followed exactly. He monitors Burns' condition for any signs that the calibration has drifted. He is, in the most literal possible sense, the person keeping Burns alive by keeping the control system running. Without Smithers, the control system degrades. Without the control system, Burns' body fails within a week. This is why Smithers' devotion to Burns carries the particular intensity it does. It is not only emotional, though the emotional component is real, and the show has explored it with genuine care. It is structural. Smithers knows, at the level of practical knowledge that comes from years of managing this specific situation, that his absence is a death sentence. He is not devoted to Burns in the way that an employee is devoted to an employer they admire. He is devoted to Burns in the way that a component of a life support system is devoted to the function it performs. Burns's survival is not a personal achievement. It is a team effort, with Smithers as the essential human element of a biological maintenance system that has been running for longer than most living things in Springfield have existed. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper Springfield's Machinery of Denial. There is an episode of The Simpsons that fans have been calling the worst in the show's history for nearly 30 years, and they may have been reading it backwards. Season 9, Episode 2. The Principal and the Pauper. The 28th of September, 1997. The backlash was immediate, fierce, and never fully subsided. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner, publicly stated his displeasure with the storyline. Critics called it the moment the show stopped caring about its own continuity. The fan community pointed to it for decades as the episode that broke faith with the audience, that retroactively made a beloved character fictional within the fiction, that proved the writers were willing to throw away anything for a story. But consider another reading, not of the episode as a mistake, but as the only episode in the show's history honest enough to show you the mechanism that makes every other episode possible. Here is the premise. Springfield Elementary holds a ceremony marking Principal Skinner's 20 years of service. During the celebration, a stranger arrives, a man nobody in Springfield recognizes. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia and presumed dead. He survived his captivity. He escaped. He came home, and he arrived in Springfield to find that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner for 2 decades is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a petty criminal with no prospects, drafted into the military and assigned to the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt guilty. He traveled to Springfield to tell Skinner's mother Agnes the news. When he arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be. She was alone and grieving, and not in a careful state of mind. Tamzarian, who had never in his life been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or a home or a name that meant anything, just let the assumption stand. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the history, the mother, the identity. He lived inside it for 20 years. Then, the original Skinner walked through the door. Springfield holds a town meeting. The truth is fully exposed. Everyone present knows exactly what happened. The real Seymour Skinner is in the room. Tamzarian is in the room. The facts are not in dispute. And the town votes. Not on whether to prosecute anyone, not on how to make the situation right, on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The vote is unanimous. They keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree establishing the imposter as the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the verified war veteran who survived captivity and came home to reclaim what was his, is tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. The judge adds a provision making it illegal to ever mention any of this under penalty of punishment. A community collectively decided the truth was less important than their comfort. They had the actual victim of a deception standing in front of them. They had irrefutable evidence. They voted to exile the evidence and criminalize the knowledge of it. Fans hated this because it destroyed what they knew about Skinner. His military service was not his. His relationship with Agnes was built on a mistake that he chose to perpetuate. His entire dynamic with Bart, 20 years of antagonism and mutual grudging respect, happened with a man who was not who he claimed to be. The episode did not merely change a character. It deleted one and replaced him with a question. This is legitimate criticism. The episode does significant damage to the show's character continuity. But it is also missing what the episode was actually doing. The Principal and the Pauper is completely honest about what Springfield is. It just says the quiet part in front of the audience instead of leaving it submerged below the surface of the show. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable fictions over uncomfortable realities. It has always found mechanisms to forget, deny, or collectively agree not to discuss things that do not fit the version of itself it prefers. The difference with this episode is that it shows you the mechanism explicitly. It shows you the vote, the legal decree, the physical act of tying truth to a railroad car and sending it away. Every other instance of Springfield doing this happens between episodes, in the negative space where the audience is not watching. This is the only episode where the machinery operates in full view. Consider how many times Springfield has experienced events that should have permanently changed the town. The Simpsons movie ends with Springfield sealed under a federal containment dome. By the next episode in the television continuity, this has not happened. The dome does not exist within the show's active memory. A comet nearly destroys the entire town in a canonical Season 6 episode, gone the following week. Homer is sued for lake pollution severe enough to involve federal regulatory intervention. Forgotten. Springfield is invaded. Springfield hosts the Olympics, and the resulting construction tears apart the civic landscape. A monorail is installed, operated by a fraudster, and immediately destroys significant infrastructure. Aliens visit and are observed by the entire population of the town. A presidential election is decided in Springfield. Each of these events should, in any show maintaining consistent continuity, leave permanent marks on the setting and the characters who live in it. In Springfield, each one is followed by a return to baseline. The town looks exactly as it did before. The characters behave as though the catastrophe never occurred. The event is never referenced again unless the script specifically needs a callback for a joke. The standard reading of this is episodic television structure. Each episode needs to be somewhat self-contained. The show cannot carry the weight of every previous plot point indefinitely. The coma theory reads it as a dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The radiation theory reads it as cognitive damage, making sustained memory of traumatic events difficult for a compromised population. The principal and the pauper offers a fourth explanation. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset, collectively and deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that says we will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed version of reality. We will treat the lie as true and the truth as something not to be spoken about in public, and anyone who insists on the contrary will be removed from the community before they can contaminate the consensus. This is not a cartoon trope. Small communities throughout history have demonstrated this capacity with disturbing consistency. Scandals get absorbed and reframed. Crimes get officially forgotten. Inconvenient histories get revised until the revised version is the only version anyone can accurately recall, because anyone who might insist on the original version is no longer around to insist on it. The social machinery for enforcing collective denial is real, and it operates in real places, not just in animated ones. Springfield is not unusual in doing this. It is unusual in showing you the paperwork. There is a reason the denial is so efficient. If Springfield acknowledged the dome, it would have to acknowledge the contamination that required the dome. If it acknowledged the contamination, it would have to address the plant. If it addressed the plant, it would have to confront Burns. If it confronted Burns, the economic structure that every resident's livelihood depends on would begin to unravel. If the economy unraveled, the town would face consequences it has neither the resources nor the cognitive function to survive. The denial is not weakness, it is survival strategy. Springfield forgets because the cost of remembering is higher than the cost of not knowing. The real Seymour Skinner arrived with proof. He stood in the middle of the community and said, with his own presence as evidence, that the narrative Springfield had been living was false, and the community's response was not gratitude for the correction. It was to criminalize the correction and remove the person making it. He was not dangerous because he was threatening anyone. He was dangerous because he was right. Being right about the wrong thing in Springfield is the one offense the town cannot tolerate. If the coma theory is true, this episode has an additional dimension. If everything since Season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario where a town votes unanimously to sustain a lie, because that is what Homer needs to believe. He needs to believe that lies can be maintained indefinitely through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real if enough people agree to treat it as real. He needs to believe that the fake version of a life can hold its shape as long as everyone around it keeps voting to protect it. Because Homer's coma is exactly that. A fake life replacing a real one. A simulation running in place of a waking existence. An identity built from the residue of a life that stopped being lived in April 1993. As long as nobody in the dream questions it, as long as the dream town keeps voting to maintain the fiction, Homer never has to face what his situation actually is. The Principal and the Pauper is not the worst Simpsons episode. It is the one that had the honesty to show you what every other episode is working to conceal. Springfield resets because it chose to. It forgets because it decided to. And anyone who shows up with evidence that the agreed version of events is wrong gets the real Seymour Skinner treatment, tied to a train, expelled from the community, sent away toward a destination nobody specified, carrying the truth that the town voted to make illegal. Armin Tamzarian is still calling himself Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. And the last honest man in a town that made honesty a punishable offense is somewhere out there on that railroad car, moving away from the life that was taken from him in a direction that nobody thought to name. Section 6. Maggie Simpson. The silence and what it conceals. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably. She communicates through pacifier sounds and the occasional expression so precise that the people around her sometimes respond to it as though she had spoken full sentences. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She sits in her high chair and watches everything and says nothing, and most people who have spent decades watching this show have absorbed her as a charming background element, a running gag about an unusually capable infant. But look at what Maggie has actually done across 36 seasons, in the moments when nobody was monitoring her closely enough. She shot a billionaire. She organized and led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical administrator, coordinating a room full of infants without verbal communication and without any of the standard tools of leadership. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations using problem-solving skills that adults in comparable situations could not have deployed. She has been formally assessed and found to possess cognitive capabilities that standardized tests cannot fully measure. She has confirmed or denied facts about situations she witnessed with a single nod of her head, and the adults around her trusted that nod without questioning it, which tells you something about what they understand, somewhere beneath conscious thought, about the mind operating behind those enormous eyes. And through all of it, she has maintained complete silence. The shooting first, because it is the act most people associate with Maggie, even though it is in some ways the least illuminating thing she has done. The official verdict is that Maggie shot Mr. Burns. We have already spent time on why the official verdict has problems. But regardless of whether Maggie actually fired the gun or was simply present when it discharged, the last shot of the resolution episode contains a detail that is worth examining very carefully. Everyone has left the hospital room. Maggie is alone. She looks around. The looking is not reflexive, it is systematic. She checks one direction, then another, confirming that the space is empty, that nobody is watching. Then, having verified her privacy, she moves her pacifier in a motion that precisely mimics pulling a trigger. That sequence of behavior requires things that are not normally present in 1 year olds. It requires situational awareness. The understanding that what she is about to do is something she should not do in front of other people. It requires memory, the ability to connect this private moment to a specific prior event. It requires caution, the deliberate step of confirming she is not observed before acting. And it requires the understanding that there is a difference between what is acceptable to do publicly and what should only be done in private. Babies do not organize behavior around this distinction. The capacity to maintain a gap between public and private behavior is a developmental milestone that children reach considerably later than 12 months. Either Maggie is not developmentally 12 months in any meaningful sense, or something has produced in her a cognitive architecture that her developmental stage should not yet support. Both of those conclusions lead to the same place. The most complete record of Maggie's capabilities is not in the regular series. It is in The Longest Daycare, a theatrical short film released in 2012, nominated for an Academy Award, approximately 7 minutes long. No dialogue, just Maggie, alone in a daycare center, trying to protect a caterpillar from a bully named Gerald while navigating a facility designed with institutional efficiency. What Maggie does in those 7 minutes is not infant behavior. She reads the physical environment systematically before acting, identifying structural features she can use. She catalogs the people present and builds an accurate model of their behavior patterns, accurate enough to predict what they will do under different conditions. She develops a plan. She executes it in stages, adapting in real time when obstacles arise. She predicts the consequences of her actions several steps ahead, anticipating Gerald's responses to each of her moves and preparing counters. She applies spatial reasoning to an environment she has never been in before. She understands timing well enough to exploit windows when others' attention is elsewhere. She makes correct decisions under pressure, consistently, without visible uncertainty. She succeeds. Her body is a significant limitation throughout this. She falls. She stumbles. The motor skills of a 1-year-old are genuinely insufficient for what her mind is trying to accomplish, and the film does not pretend otherwise. She succeeds in spite of her body, not because of it. Her intelligence compensates for every physical limitation the situation places in her path. She is operating at a cognitive level that her physical development cannot support, and she navigates the gap between mind and body with the specific patience of someone who has been doing this for a while. The show has measured Maggie's intelligence directly across several episodes, with results that vary in their specifics while being consistent in their implication. She is not a normal baby. Her cognitive capabilities exceed what her developmental stage should produce by a margin that standardized testing cannot accurately capture. The family registers this occasionally, briefly, and then returns to treating her as a baby because she is a baby. And the alternative, treating an infant as a strategic intelligence operating from deliberate invisibility, is cognitively uncomfortable territory. The silence is the center of everything about Maggie. She spoke once. Her first word was daddy, voiced in a cameo by Elizabeth Taylor, treated by the episode as significant. It happened once. It was never repeated. In 36 years of the show, surrounded by a household of extremely verbal people, Maggie has not developed language in any meaningful way. Homer talks constantly. Marge narrates her worries aloud. Bart provokes everyone within range as a matter of character. Lisa lectures and argues and debates. The Simpson house is a wall of continuous noise, and in the middle of it, Maggie sits in silence, watching everything, processing everything, saying nothing. The theory that her silence is developmental delay cannot survive the evidence. Children developing normally begin language acquisition early and accelerate. The cognitive capabilities the show has demonstrated Maggie possesses are incompatible with developmental delay. A child who can plan, predict, adapt, and organize does not fail to acquire language because her brain cannot manage it. She fails to acquire language because her brain has decided not to use it. The silence is a strategy. Look at what has happened to the intelligent women in the Simpson family. Lisa is brilliant. Her IQ is documented across multiple episodes as significantly above normal. She is the most cognitively capable member of the family by any metric the show provides. And what has that intelligence produced for her in Springfield? Isolation from peers who cannot follow her? Mockery from the community she tries to improve? Dismissal from her parents, who love her but cannot quite keep up? Consistent undervaluation from a town that does not want to be challenged or asked to reconsider things it has already settled? Lisa speaks and gets ignored. Lisa challenges authority and gets punished. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and gets flattened by the weight of a community that has decided improvement is threatening. Lisa wears her intelligence on the outside. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room, and the room responds by demonstrating over and over how little that matters in Springfield. Maggie has been watching this happen since the day she was born. She has had a front-row seat to the ongoing education of a brilliant older sister who keeps bringing her intelligence to bear on a community that does not want it and keeps absorbing the cost of that rejection. Maggie has been building a model of what intelligent visibility costs in this particular environment, and she drew a conclusion from that model that is the opposite of the conclusion Lisa reached. Not keep fighting regardless of the cost. The opposite. Watch, learn, stay invisible. Let them categorize you as helpless and unthreatening, because people who feel unthreatened do not monitor you carefully, and people who do not monitor you carefully cannot stop you from doing what you have decided to do. Every significant thing Maggie has done in this show has been possible because nobody was watching closely enough to prevent it. Burns was shot because nobody carefully monitors what a baby is doing in a parking lot after an evening meeting. The daycare rebellion succeeded because authority figures do not surveil infants as potential organizers. Every heroic act, every display of capability, every moment where Maggie's intelligence was decisive, it happened in the space created by other people's assumption that she was not a factor. She has been manufacturing that space for 36 years. Silence is not the absence of thought. In Maggie's case, silence is protection. It is the mechanism by which she maintains a position of invisibility in a community that punishes intelligence the moment it becomes visible. Now bring the radiation theory into contact with this. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces different mutations in different people, if the specific biological alteration varies based on factors the show does not fully specify, then Homer and Maggie are the two poles of the spectrum. Homer's exposure, combined with the specific physical damage of a crayon lodged in his brain from childhood, pushed his cognitive function down to clinical disability. Maggie's exposure, applied to a developing infant brain in its most plastic period, may have done the opposite. Not diminishment, but amplification. Not a brain made slower, but a brain made faster, more connected, capable of things that normal development would take years to produce. Same environmental source, same family, same contaminated water and irradiated air. Where the father's cognition was reduced, the youngest daughter's was expanded. Homer and Maggie are two outcomes of the same cause. If the coma theory is true, Maggie's intelligence is something different again. If every episode since 1993 is Homer's dream, her extraordinary capabilities are not a product of radiation or unusual development. They are a father's hope for a child he cannot watch grow up. He cannot be there for her. He cannot protect her. He cannot see what she becomes. So, in the dream, he makes her capable of protecting herself. He gives her the intelligence to navigate any situation without needing the parent who is lying unconscious in a hospital bed. He makes her indestructible in the way a father who cannot be present makes his child indestructible, by imagining it so thoroughly that the imagining becomes the only thing he has left to offer. Maggie's genius in that reading is Homer's prayer translated into narrative, the most heartbreaking kind of parental love. The kind that has to be expressed entirely in imagination because the real version of it is no longer accessible. The show has never revealed what Maggie is building toward. It has shown fragments, the gun, the daycare, the butterfly saved, the single word spoken once and never repeated. It has gestured at something accumulating behind 36 years of strategic silence and then withheld the conclusion. And that withholding, that deliberate refusal to close the question, may be the most accurate thing the show has ever done for this character. Maggie is still watching. She has been watching for 36 years, taking notes on everything Springfield is, everything the Simpson family is, everything that is wrong with both, storing it behind the pacifier and the enormous eyes and the silence that everyone around her has mistaken for inability. She is 1 year old. She cannot walk without falling. She cannot form sentences. By every surface measure, the most helpless person in the most dysfunctional family in the most impossible town in American fiction, and she may be the most capable person on Evergreen Terrace. When she finally acts, when she finally breaks her silence and reveals what has been building behind that blank expression, Springfield will not see it coming. That is exactly the outcome she has been designing. Section 7. The Predictions Phenomenon. In the year 2000, The Simpsons aired an episode called Bart to the Future. In that episode, a flash-forward sequence depicts a future version of the United States in which Lisa Simpson has become the first female president. During an early briefing in the Oval Office, Lisa's staff informs her that she has inherited a significant budget deficit from her predecessor. The predecessor is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. When Trump won, screenshots of that episode circulated across every major platform simultaneously. People who had not watched The Simpsons in decades were sharing the clip with captions asking how they knew. The Simpsons predicted Trump became a meme that transcended the show's actual fan base and entered the broader cultural conversation about what the show was and how it worked. And it was the most famous entry on a list that extends considerably further. In 1995, an episode depicted a device that functions like a modern smartwatch, a wrist-mounted screen that receives and displays messages, years before the technology entered mainstream consumer markets. In 1998, Homer encounters a mathematical equation that experts have noted bears a striking resemblance to the formula for predicting the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012. In 1999, Homer proposes that the universe is shaped like a donut. Cosmologists later identified radiation patterns, suggesting the universe may have a toroidal structure. In a 1993 episode called Marge in Chains, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield, causing panic buying, supply shortages, and a community-wide search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. During the fictional outbreak, the townspeople accidentally release a swarm of killer bees, which became unsettling in 2020 when Asian giant hornets, dubbed murder hornets by media outlets, appeared in the United States during the actual pandemic year. In 1996, an episode called Homerpalooza featured a joke about Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra for the same event while under the influence. That exact collaboration happened in 2024 when Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the reality it described. In 1998, the show depicted a major entertainment conglomerate acquiring 20th Century Fox. Disney completed that acquisition in 2019. The list continues. Video calling technology shown before it existed. Autocorrect failures as a joke about word processing software, years before touchscreen keyboards made the joke universally relatable. Surveillance culture as dystopian satire, long before the conversation about data collection became part of everyday life. The show has accumulated enough of these apparent predictions that they have become their own genre of internet content, with new examples surfacing regularly and each one generating the same mixture of genuine surprise and the particular fascination that comes from a pattern that seems too consistent to be accidental. The answer from the people who make the show is straightforward, and they have given it often enough that it constitutes an official position. Al Jean, longtime executive producer, has addressed the prediction phenomenon repeatedly. His explanation is simple. When you throw enough darts, some of them hit bullseyes. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, cultural observations, and satirical extrapolations. When you generate that volume of content over that span of time, statistical probability alone guarantees that some portion of it will align with subsequent real-world events. The alignment is not prophetic. It is inevitable given the quantity. Producer Bill Oakley framed it differently but arrived at the same conclusion. Most of the apparent predictions are coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history has had time to cycle back to situations they described. That is the official position. Coincidence, volume, and the cyclical nature of events. Systematic fact-checking of the most celebrated claimed predictions has generally supported this. Most have explanations grounded in trend analysis. The Trump prediction is the most famous, and the explanation is that Trump had been publicly discussing the possibility of running for president since at least 1988, that celebrity culture and political culture had been converging for years, and that the show was not predicting an outcome so much as extending an observable trajectory to its logical conclusion. Celebrity politics were already happening. Trump was already one of the most publicly political celebrities in America. The show made a joke about where that trend pointed. The Disney-Fox prediction follows identical logic. Media consolidation had been accelerating for years. The major studios had clear financial incentives to absorb competitors. The show made a gag about the logical endpoint. The Simpsons writing room has historically been staffed by some of the most academically credentialed writers in American television. Many hold advanced degrees from elite institutions. Several have backgrounds in mathematics, sciences, political theory, and economics. These are not people making random guesses. They are unusually perceptive observers of American society who spend their careers studying systems, identifying trends, and extending current trajectories to their most absurd but logical conclusions. This covers the majority of the list, but not all of it. There is a subset of the claimed predictions where specificity exceeds what trend extrapolation accounts for. The Trump prediction did not merely anticipate that celebrity might enter politics in the abstract. It specified Trump by name. A later episode depicted him descending a moving staircase in a visual sequence that closely mirrors the actual announcement he made in 2015, a specific staging detail that cannot be derived from analysis of broad cultural trends. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not merely note that trained exotic animals carry risk. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers in a way that maps precisely onto the actual 2003 incident in which Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's tigers. These are not trend extrapolations. These are details. And the gap between trend and detail is where the more interesting theory lies. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it, not through supernatural means, through cultural influence so deep and so sustained across so long a period that it becomes difficult to perceive from inside it. The Simpsons has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its observations about American life have become reference points that people carry into their experience of that life. Its jokes have entered the American vocabulary in a way that few individual cultural productions achieve. When the show depicts something as inevitable satire, the depiction itself changes the cultural environment in which the thing might eventually happen. When the show made a joke about Trump running for president and descending an escalator in a gaudy building, that image entered the cultural imagination. Millions of people saw it. They carried it. When Trump actually descended an escalator in Trump Tower to announce his candidacy, a portion of the viewing population experienced something that was not pure shock, because they had been shown something adjacent to it before. The show primed the cultural expectation. It made the scenario feel familiar before it arrived. And when it arrived, the reaction was not purely surprise. It was recognition. We have seen this before. The show did not create Trump's candidacy, but it contributed to a cultural environment in which a Trump candidacy felt less like a genuine rupture with reality and more like a conclusion that had been telegraphed for a while. The show made the impossible feel like the obvious next step, and then the next step arrived, and the audience responded with déjà vu that the internet translated into prophecy. This dynamic operates across many of the celebrated predictions. The show does not foresee events. It normalizes possible futures by presenting them as accomplished facts, as satire, as jokes about where things are obviously going. When those futures arrive, the cultural machinery the show primed responds with a particular familiarity that social media interprets as evidence of foreknowledge. Springfield does not reflect America. America has been, gradually and incrementally over 36 years, growing into the portrait Springfield held up for it. The corrupt billionaire who cannot be held accountable. The nuclear plant that everyone knows is dangerous but that nobody can challenge because the economy depends on it. The government that is openly incompetent without this constituting a crisis. The community that forgets catastrophes with suspicious efficiency. The population that is aware something is wrong but cannot focus on what it is or who is responsible. These are not predictions of where America was heading. They are a diagnosis of where America already was when the show began. The writers saw it clearly enough to write it down in 1989, and America has been, in the decades since, growing into the description. There is one more element worth noting. The Simpsons has also produced thousands of predictions that did not come true. Jokes about jetpacks and moon colonies and technologies that never materialized. Jokes about political outcomes that went completely differently. Jokes about cultural shifts that did not occur. Nobody catalogs these. Nobody builds internet content around the times The Simpsons anticipated something and was completely wrong. Confirmation bias operates by selective retention. We remember the hits and absorb them into a narrative about the show's nature. The misses dissolve. When you filter 800 episodes of satirical observations through a mechanism that amplifies matches and discards misses, you produce a highlight reel that looks like prophecy. The appearance of prophetic ability is the artifact of the selection process, not of the show. The Simpsons did not predict the future. It wrote enough possible futures that some of them were statistically guaranteed to arrive. And the ones that arrived are the only ones anyone remembers. But try explaining that the next time a clip from 1,996 lines up with a headline from tomorrow. Even knowing exactly how the mechanism works, it is still striking to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years. And enough bullseyes to make even the show's own creators pause occasionally and wonder whether they understood something about where things were going that they could not quite articulate, even to themselves. Section 8. Mona Simpson and the Three-Generation Conspiracy. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the established fact. Abe had told him so when Homer was young. She was gone. He had stood at her grave and mourned her. He had grown up carrying the specific weight of a motherless childhood, without ever being given a reason why or an explanation he could hold. That loss shaped everything about the adult Homer Simpson. The desperate need for approval from everyone around him, The clinginess with Marge, the way he reaches for her during moments of stress with an intensity that goes past ordinary affection into something more like anchoring. The terror of abandonment that the show has depicted across dozens of episodes, in forms ranging from comic to genuinely painful. The willingness to absorb humiliation from his employer without ever reaching a real breaking point. The compulsive need to be liked by everyone in his immediate orbit, regardless of whether they have done anything to earn his regard. Considered together, these traits form a coherent picture of a person whose formative experience of loss was never fully processed because it was never honestly explained. Homer Simpson's personality is a coping mechanism for maternal abandonment that was never given a context in which it could heal. Season 7 changed that. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired the 19th of November, 1995, and it is consistently ranked among the greatest episodes in the series. Not because it is funny, but because it is honest in a way the show rarely achieves at full commitment. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working a Saturday, which is the kind of inciting premise that makes clear what kind of show this is before the larger story begins. When Marge insists he correct the official death record, Homer visits the Hall of Records and discovers something that restructures his understanding of his own history. According to official documentation, his mother is alive. The grave Abe showed him as a child belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been using a famous writer's burial marker as a stand-in for a woman who was not dead. He had told Homer a lie and maintained it across Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes to be her son's grave. The reunion between them is quiet and careful, with the particular hesitance of two people who have become strangers across decades of separation. When he proves who he is, something opens between them, and the episode handles it without reaching for sentimentality. Then Mona tells him what actually happened. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have endangered him and Abe. Because the man who owned the power plant, the man Homer would grow up to work for without ever knowing the connection, had identified her to federal authorities and made it impossible for her to remain Mona Simpson. She became a fugitive. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and slipped out into the night for 27 years. The story begins in 1969. Mona was ordinary. Married to Abe, mother of young Homer, living a domestic life in Springfield, while the world outside was moving through the upheaval of the Vietnam era. And then something shifted. She joined a group of activists who believed in direct action against systems causing harm. Their target was a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. This is worth pausing on. Burns did not merely own a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations. He was operating a germ warfare facility, a laboratory developing biological weapons located in the same community where Homer was growing up, where families went about their lives without knowing that the richest man in town was manufacturing weaponized pathogens nearby. Mona and her group broke into the laboratory. They deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent inside. During the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be a young Clancy Wiggum, the man who would grow up to become Springfield's chief of police. A detail the show uses for humor, but which also quietly establishes that the network of people connected to this event extends further than anyone realizes. The raid succeeded. The weapons were destroyed. But Mona made one mistake. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. That person was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons program she had just dismantled, and Burns looked up and saw her face. He reported her to the FBI, and from that moment, Mona became a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not hold her son or explain to him what was happening. She kissed Homer goodbye and disappeared into the night. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she had died, and Homer spent the next 27 years building a personality around the assumption that he was someone whose mother chose not to be there. When Mona reappears in season 7, after 27 years, Burns spots her almost immediately through a cab window at a distance. After more than 2 decades, he recognizes her, calls the authorities, and the FBI comes to the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer says goodbye to the mother he just found for the second time, knowing now exactly why she is leaving and who is responsible. The man driving his mother away from him on this specific evening is his employer. The man who destroyed Mona's life and shaped Homer's childhood into something traumatic is the man who signs Homer's paycheck. Homer earns his living from the person who took his mother from him, and Homer does not connect these facts in any way that produces a meaningful response. He does not confront Burns. He does not resign. He does not even appear to fully register the relationship between the billionaire who employs him and the billionaire who stole his childhood. The show does not play this as a joke. It plays it as damage. Homer's inability to make this connection is not stupidity in the comic register. It is the accumulated effect of everything the show has established about what Springfield has done to Homer's brain. Burns did not just ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was young, Burns created the conditions that produced a specific, broken version of Homer Simpson. Desperate for approval, terrified of abandonment, constitutionally incapable of challenging authority because authority figures have always controlled whether Homer has the stability he needs. Grateful for any kind of stability regardless of the conditions attached to it. These are not incidental personality traits. They are precisely the traits you need in an employee who will work in a dangerous facility for decades without demanding better conditions, who will accept being ignored and mistreated because the alternative, losing the job, activates a fear that goes deeper than any reasonable calculation of self-interest. Homer works at the nuclear power plant because Burns broke him as a child. And the broken version of Homer is exactly what Burns needed in Sector 7G. The show confirms the architecture of this in a later episode, revealing that Burns and Abe made a deal. Burns had committed a crime. Abe had learned of it. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant, no matter how many errors he made, no matter how catastrophically he performed his duties, no matter how many times normal employment practice would dictate termination. 742 documented errors. Job never genuinely at risk. Homer's job security, which the show had always presented as a running joke about the inexplicable resilience of incompetent employees, was a contractual arrangement. Burns purchasing Abe's silence with a guarantee about Homer's livelihood. Homer working his entire adult life at a facility slowly compromising his health, under the authority of the man who destroyed his family, protected by a deal made between his father and his mother's persecutor, without any knowledge of the deal or what it had cost. This is the full conspiracy. Burns did not simply own a nuclear plant. He operated a biological weapons program. He pursued a woman who disrupted that program with the specific, sustained vindictiveness of someone who does not forget. He drove her underground for 27 years. He forced Abe into a deal that guaranteed Homer's employment in exchange for silence. And he benefited from a Homer who was emotionally and cognitively incapable of connecting any of these facts together into an understanding of his own situation. 3 generations of the Simpson family, systematically broken by one man's power and one man's refusal to let go of a grudge. Abe made a deal he should not have made and buried what he knew to protect it. Mona fought against something real and lost everything. Homer inherited the consequences without the context to understand them, becoming exactly the kind of person Burns needed, without ever knowing that the system had been working to produce him. Mona died in a later episode. The death scene is quiet. Homer beside her, holding her hand. No joke in it. No reset at the end of the act to lighten the weight. Just a man and his mother, and the weight of 27 stolen years, pressing down on a hospital room. The Simpsons is a comedy. This has always been true. But underneath decades of Homer falling down and getting back up, underneath the gag structure and the couch jokes and the celebrity appearances and the resets, there is a story about a family that was dismantled by one man's power and one community's inability to resist it. Mona fought and lost everything. Abe negotiated and lost something different. Homer endured without ever fully understanding what he was enduring. Burns won. Burns always wins in Springfield. The man with the money writes the rules, including the ones about who gets to come home. And Homer will work at the power plant until the end, because his grandfather made a deal, and his mother made a choice, and the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G. Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Nobody in the town that did it to him will ever answer for it. Because Springfield voted to make that a rule too, the principal and the pauper is often discussed as though its primary problem is the damage it does to Skinner's character. Critics focus on the retroactive falsification of his military service, his relationship with Agnes, his history with Bart. But this framing treats the episode as a story about Skinner, when the episode is actually a story about Springfield. Skinner is the protagonist in the nominal sense that the revelation centers on him and affects him most directly. But the interesting character in the episode is the town. What Springfield does when confronted with irrefutable evidence that a major public figure has been living a false identity for 20 years is more revealing about the show's understanding of itself than anything that happens to Skinner individually. The town meeting scene is worth examining in detail because it depicts, in compressed form, the decision-making process that Springfield performs continuously across dozens of episodes, usually invisibly. The real Seymour Skinner stands in the room. The imposter stands in the room. The facts are established. Nobody disputes the facts. The community has complete information. And then they proceed to make a collective decision about what to do with that information. The option to investigate further does not appear to be on the table. The option to restore the real Skinner to his identity, to make the situation right in the conventional sense, is raised but quickly displaced by a different consideration. The community is not asking what is true. It is not even asking what is just. It is asking what is comfortable. What allows daily life in Springfield to continue with the least disruption? What maintains the social arrangements that people have built their lives around, regardless of whether those arrangements were built on accurate information? The imposter has been principal of Springfield Elementary for 20 years. Dozens of children have passed through his school. Teachers have worked under his administration. Parents have attended meetings in his office. An entire educational institution has been organized around his presence in a role that was never legitimately his. Acknowledging the truth would require acknowledging that all of those interactions, all of those years, were built on a foundation that did not belong to the man who provided it. This is not a situation Springfield is equipped to handle honestly. Honest handling would require too much revision of too many things at once. It would require acknowledging not just that this specific man was not who he said he was, but that everything built around his false identity is now contingent on how the community decides to process that falsehood. It would require examining what else in the community's shared life might be built on similarly uncertain foundations. And that examination, once started, does not have a natural stopping point. Better to vote. Better to make the lie legal. Better to exile the inconvenient truth on a railroad car and make it a criminal offense to relitigate the matter. The community can absorb the cost of maintaining the lie. It cannot absorb the cost of confronting what the truth implies. This logic is not unique to Springfield. It is the logic that operates in any community that has built significant social infrastructure on a foundation it would rather not examine too closely. Springfield just performs it openly, in a town meeting, with a legal decree, so that the mechanism is visible to anyone watching carefully enough to see it. And the show has been performing this mechanism continuously across 36 seasons, in every episode where Springfield forgets a catastrophe, and in every episode where an obvious implication is carefully never drawn. The Principal and the Pauper was not a bad episode that revealed a flaw in the show's moral architecture. It was the episode where the show's moral architecture became explicitly visible. The real Seymour Skinner is the show's most important minor character, not because of what happened to him, but because of what the community's response to him reveals. He arrived with proof. He had documentation, a military record, a personal history, a face that people who had known the original Skinner might have recognized as different from the man claiming the identity. He did everything you are supposed to do when you have been wronged. He showed up. He produced evidence. He made his case. And Springfield determined that the problem was not that someone had been living his life. The problem was that he had arrived to say so. The solution was not to restore his life. The solution was to remove him. To tie the problem to a train and send it away from the community. Not toward anywhere specific. Just away. Out of view. Past the edge of the frame. Into the space that Springfield maintains for things it has decided it does not want to know. That is the show's clearest articulation of its own operating logic. And that is why, of all the episodes that fans have nominated as the worst, this one gets that designation most consistently. It is not the worst episode. It is the most uncomfortable one. It holds the mirror up at an angle that is hard to look at directly. The question of what Maggie would actually do if she spoke, if she stopped performing helplessness and revealed the full scope of what she has been building, is one the show has circled for decades without landing. There are flash-forward episodes that offer glimpses. In some, Maggie becomes a musician, her talent for the saxophone inherited from Lisa appearing in an adult form. In others, she becomes someone prominent in ways the show does not fully specify. But these are flash-forwards, hypotheticals, windows that open briefly and close before the show has to commit to them. The show's reluctance to commit makes a kind of sense under both the radiation theory and the coma theory. Under the radiation theory, Maggie's intelligence is so far beyond what Springfield can accommodate that her full expression would shatter the equilibrium that keeps the town functioning. A Maggie who spoke, who revealed her analysis of Springfield's situation, who laid out clearly and precisely what she has understood about the contamination and the denial and the machinery that keeps the population compliant, would be the real Seymour Skinner situation at a level the town could not manage with a simple vote. She would be too specific, too accurate, too well-informed to be easily dismissed. She has been watching for 36 years. She knows everything. And she has been waiting, with the patience of a person who understands that timing matters, for the moment when knowing everything can be used to change something. Under the coma theory, Maggie cannot speak because Homer's brain cannot imagine what she would say. Homer does not know who Maggie is becoming. He cannot know. He went under before she was old enough to have developed a personality beyond the earliest infant expressions. Everything Homer's dream attributes to Maggie is projection, hope, the imagined capabilities of a child he cannot watch grow up. But a grown Maggie, a Maggie with a voice and a perspective and a history of her own, is beyond what Homer's reference material can generate. The dream can show her being capable. It cannot show her being specific, because specific would require Homer to know her, and he does not know who she has become. This is why every Maggie flash-forward is vague about what she actually says and what she actually does. The dream can project competence. It cannot project specificity. It cannot show Homer something he has no basis for imagining. But the show does occasionally give Maggie moments of genuine specificity that are worth noting because they are more revealing than they appear in the moment. The nod. On several occasions, Maggie communicates through a single nod in response to a direct question, and the people around her treat the nod as reliable confirmation, not as the reflexive motor response of an infant to a stimulus, as a genuine assertion, as a yes that carries the weight of deliberate communication. This is not how people treat babies. People do not ask babies questions and treat their physical movements as accurate answers. The Simpson family does this with Maggie because they understand, somewhere they have not put into words, that Maggie's responses mean something, that she is choosing her answers, that the nod is not an accident but a statement. The family has built, implicitly, a communicative relationship with a pre-verbal person that treats her communications as trustworthy. This does not happen by default. It happens because the person has demonstrated, through a pattern of accurate and consistent responses, that their communications are trustworthy. The family has learned, from experience, that when Maggie nods, Maggie means yes, and that Maggie is accurate about what she means. They have learned to trust her judgment. A family that trusts the judgment of a 1-year-old has either very poor judgment themselves or has encountered evidence sufficient to establish that the 1-year-old's judgment is worth trusting. Given the caliber of Maggie's demonstrated reasoning in every other context the show provides, the second option is clearly what the show intends. The Simpson family, without ever saying so explicitly, has recognized that the youngest member of the family is the one whose assessment is most reliable. They consult her. They trust her nods. They do not articulate what this implies about her, because articulating it would require confronting the gap between who Maggie presents as and who Maggie is. They take the evidence without following it to its conclusion, which is exactly what Springfield does with everything it does not want to know. The Maggie question and the Springfield question are the same question. What do you do when the evidence is right in front of you and following it leads somewhere you are not sure you are ready to go? Springfield's answer has always been to absorb the evidence without processing it. To take the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire and the baby who shot a man and the principal who is not who he says he is, and the town that sealed itself in a dome, and add each one to the background noise of a community that has decided these things are simply part of the texture of life here. The Simpsons, the family, does the same thing with Maggie. They take the nods. They accept the assistance when she saves them from danger. They trust the judgment when she offers it. And they continue to put her in the high chair and feed her with a small spoon and talk about her as the baby, because the alternative, which is acknowledging what they actually have in that high chair, would require a kind of reckoning that the show has never been quite willing to force, until Maggie forces it herself, which she will, eventually, in the fullness of a time that Springfield will never quite allow to arrive. The feedback loop between The Simpsons and American culture is worth thinking about more carefully than the predictions discussion usually allows. Most of the conversation focuses on specific instances where the show apparently anticipated something. But the more interesting question is about the cumulative effect of a show that has been depicting American life with satirical accuracy for over 3 decades on the culture it is depicting. When a show runs long enough and reaches deeply enough into the cultural imagination, it does not merely comment on the culture, it participates in it. The Simpsons has been running since before most of its current audience was born. Its specific observations about American institutions, American communities, American families, American workplaces, American politics and economics and social life have been circulating in the American imagination for 36 years. That is long enough for those observations to have influenced the way people understand the things being observed. When the show depicts a corrupt politician as a specific type, complete with specific behaviors and specific rationalizations, viewers who encounter real politicians with similar traits will experience a flicker of recognition that they would not have had without the show. The show has given them a template. It has made the type legible, and legibility affects response. People who have been given a template for recognizing a type respond differently to instances of that type than people encountering the type fresh. The same applies to the nuclear power plant, the billionaire, the government inspector who is too compromised to do his job, the community that chooses comfortable fiction over uncomfortable fact. The Simpsons has been depicting these types and situations for decades, and American viewers have been encountering the real-world versions of them with the show's templates already loaded. The show did not predict the specific instances, but it may have shaped how those specific instances felt when they arrived. This is a form of culture, a cross-influence that is genuinely difficult to measure and genuinely difficult to dismiss. When something happens that resembles something The Simpsons depicted, people experience it through the show's framing as well as through their own direct response. The show's specific way of understanding something becomes one of the available ways of understanding the thing when it appears in reality. And once enough people are using the same cultural template, the template starts to shape the phenomenon as well as describe it. Politicians begin to understand themselves in relation to the characters the culture has given them. Communities recognize their own dynamics in the dynamics the show has made legible. The satirical depiction of a type is simultaneously a description of existing instances and a contribution to the conditions that produce future instances. This is not supernatural. It is the basic mechanism by which culture works. Representations shape expectations. Expectations shape behavior. Behavior produces the outcomes that representations then describe. The Simpsons has been doing this for 36 years on a scale that few cultural productions have ever achieved. Its representations of American types and American situations have been loaded into the cultural imagination of multiple generations. When those types and situations appear in reality, they appear to people who have already been given a way of seeing them. And the way of seeing them that the show provided was always, at its core, a way of seeing them as inevitable, as the obvious next step, as something that was going to happen and that anyone paying attention could see coming. That is what makes the predictions feel prophetic, even after you understand the mechanism. The show did not know the future. The show made the future feel like it was already in motion before it arrived. And when it arrived, the feeling of inevitability that the show had cultivated made it land as recognition rather than surprise. This is a form of power that goes beyond any specific prediction. It is the power of having provided the culture's vocabulary for understanding itself. And The Simpsons has been exercising that power continuously and cumulatively for longer than most of the people currently alive in America have been watching. The deal between Burns and Abe Simpson is worth sitting with carefully because it is the element of the conspiracy that most directly implicates Abe himself as a knowing participant in the system that broke his son. Abe is presented throughout the show as a figure of mild pathos. The old man who used to be something, who served in the war, who raised Homer without much apparent success, who lives in a retirement home and tells stories that nobody listens to and represents the particular loss that comes with age in a culture that has little patience for the old. He is a figure the show is gentle with, even affectionate toward, in the way you can be affectionate towards someone whose failures you understand without condoning. But the deal reframes Abe significantly. Abe did not make a passive mistake. He did not fail Homer through inattention or incompetence. He made an active choice. He discovered something incriminating about Burns, something significant enough that Burns offered a meaningful concession to secure Abe's silence. He evaluated the concession, determined that it met his needs, and accepted. He traded his knowledge of Burns's crime for a guarantee about his son's employment, and then maintained that arrangement in silence for the remainder of his life. This means Abe knew, throughout Homer's adult life, that Homer's job security was not a function of Homer's performance or Burns's negligence. He knew it was the product of a deal. He knew that Homer was working for the man whose crime Abe had agreed not to report. He knew that the arrangement between them meant Homer would be protected in that job regardless of what he did, which meant Homer would never have a reason to leave, which meant Homer would spend his entire adult working life inside the facility that was slowly altering his biology. Abe knew all of this. He maintained the secret. He let Homer believe his job security was something ordinary, something he had earned, something that reflected the world's reasonable accommodation of his presence, rather than a contractual arrangement negotiated without Homer's knowledge or consent. This is not a passive failure. This is a set of active choices made across decades to maintain a deception that served Abe's interests at Homer's expense. The deception was comfortable. Homer had a stable job. The family was fed. The arrangement worked, in the sense that it produced no immediate crisis. But the cost of the arrangement was Homer's autonomy, his ability to understand his own situation, his capacity to make genuinely free choices about where he worked and for whom and under what conditions. None of those things were available to Homer because Abe had traded them away for a guarantee that Abe, not Homer, needed. The lie about Mona is the same structure at a different scale. Abe told Homer his mother was dead. He maintained that story across Homer's entire childhood and adulthood. He showed Homer a grave that was not hers. He created the emotional architecture of Homer's personality around a loss that was, in its specific form, a lie that Abe constructed. Homer's terror of abandonment, his desperate need for approval, his inability to challenge authority figures, all of this grew in the soil of a grief that Abe manufactured. Abe is not a villain in the show's conventional sense. He is not calculating harm. He is a man who made a series of bad choices, mostly motivated by some combination of self-preservation and the specific cowardice that comes from not wanting to face difficult conversations. He did not tell Homer the truth about his mother because telling Homer the truth would have required explaining why Mona left, which would have required explaining Burns's role in it, which would have required explaining the deal, which would have required dismantling the entire structure that Abe had built to protect himself from the consequences of what he had done and what he had failed to do. The cover-up compounds. One deception requires another. The lie about Mona required the lie about the grave. The deal with Burns required the lie about Mona. The lie about the deal required pretending that Homer's situation was normal. Each deception was load-bearing for the ones around it. Pull any one of them and the others become visible. Abe had a choice at many points over many decades to start pulling. He never did. Homer is the result, not of accident and bad luck and the general difficulty of life in Springfield, of a specific, sustained, multi-generational series of choices that prioritize the comfort of the people making them over the well-being of the person most affected by them. Burns made his choices. Abe made his choices. And Homer, born into the consequences of both, with a brain that was already being shaped by the contaminated environment around him before he was old enough to understand what was happening, became exactly the kind of person both systems needed him to be. The tragedy of Homer Simpson is not that he is stupid or lazy or incapable of being anything other than what he is. The tragedy is that the system he was born into worked very hard, across 3 generations, to ensure that he would be exactly what he became. And it succeeded. Section 9. Where is Springfield? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can identify Springfield than can name the capital of half the actual states. And after 36 seasons of the show that made it famous, nobody knows where it is. This is not a result of incomplete research. It is the result of a deliberate, sustained, architecturally maintained impossibility. The show has been actively preventing Springfield's location from being established for its entire run, and the mechanism of that prevention is more interesting than any answer to the question could be. The geography of Springfield is a contradiction layered on top of a contradiction. The town has oceanfront property. It also has mountain ranges accessible within a single episode. It has desert nearby and farmland and forests and a gorge. There is a harbor and a ski slope. The weather ranges from severe blizzards to tropical heat within the same season. Springfield borders Ohio and Nevada and Maine and Kentucky, depending on which episode you are watching, without the production appearing troubled by this. The state abbreviation has been depicted as NT, which corresponds to no actual state. Lisa's area code in one episode begins with 636, which is a Missouri exchange. When Homer calls the state capital, the voice on the other end identifies the state as beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some options while leaving enough viable candidates that the mystery remains open. In one episode, Springfield is clearly in the north. In another, it is clearly in the south. The show plants clues and then plants contradictions with the consistency of a system designed to resist resolution. Matt Groening addressed this in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine and provided what looked like a definitive answer. He said he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up nearby, and that he chose Springfield as a name because it is one of the most common city names in America, giving the show a feeling of universal familiarity regardless of where viewers actually lived. For roughly 48 hours, the question appeared settled. Springfield was in Oregon, the creator had spoken. Then the show continued adding contradictions. Episodes aired after the interview placed Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's stated answer. The mystery kept running because the mystery is not an accidental byproduct of the show's continuity management. It is part of the design. The surface-level explanation, the one the show has always offered and which is genuinely true as far as it goes, is that Springfield is meant to feel universal. It is every American town, assembled from the elements that American communities share rather than the specifics that distinguish them. Industrial decay from the Rust Belt. Suburban sprawl from the Sun Belt. Small-town social insularity from New England. Cultural blankness from the Midwest. The town is everywhere because it was built from the common vocabulary of American community life rather than from a specific address. Viewers in any state can watch Springfield and recognize something of their own town in it, because Springfield was designed to hold pieces of every American town simultaneously. This is true. It is the intentional design philosophy. Groening and the writers have confirmed it in various interviews across many years. But it is also the beginning of the question rather than the end of it. Universal design does not require active contradiction. You can build a show in a deliberately generic American community without engineering multiple layers of geographic impossibility. Springfield does not merely decline to specify its location, it creates false leads. It establishes apparent clues and then plants episodes that undermine them. It does the sustained, ongoing work of building a mystery around a question it could simply have left unanswered. The question is why? Apply the radiation theory. If Springfield is a contamination zone, if its residents have been physically altered by what the nuclear plant releases into the environment, then the question of regulatory jurisdiction over the plant's most significant hazards is not academic. Federal environmental oversight is assigned based on geography. State regulatory agencies operate within state boundaries. Nuclear oversight is assigned based on where facilities are located. If Springfield has no fixed location, if the state it sits in changes depending on which episode you are watching, then there is no consistent regulatory authority that can claim clear jurisdiction. No state attorney general who can be pressured into investigating 342 safety violations. No EPA regional office with unambiguous responsibility for what has been entering the water supply. Springfield cannot be held accountable because Springfield cannot be definitively located. It floats between jurisdictions because landing in a specific state would mean answering to that state's laws, and answering to those laws might require someone to explain the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the glowing billionaire wandering through the woods. Geographic ambiguity is a legal shield. Apply the coma theory. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise map of America stored in its memory banks. It has impressions, fragments of places he visited or saw on television or drove through, assembled without regard for geographic logic because dreams do not require geographic logic. They require emotional logic. Springfield feels like America because it was assembled from Homer's memory of America, which is scattered and incomplete and held together by the feeling of home, rather than by any accurate spatial understanding of where home is located. Under the coma theory, Springfield does not need to be in any particular state because it does not exist in physical space. It exists in Homer's mind, built from every American landscape he ever encountered, placing mountains next to oceans and deserts next to farmland because those are the impressions he carries and because dreams are not required to place them accurately. Apply the collective denial framework from The Principal and the Pauper. If Springfield maintains its impossible reality through community consensus, through the collective decision to agree on a version of reality that is comfortable rather than true, then the town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate expression of that same dynamic. You cannot investigate a town you cannot locate. You cannot serve legal process to a facility whose jurisdiction is perpetually in question. Springfield's geographic ambiguity is not a production quirk. It is the spatial expression of a community that has decided it prefers not to be found. The episode Behind the Laughter, a 12th season mockumentary, resolved the question in its original broadcast by identifying Springfield's location as northern Kentucky. In the syndicated rerun version of the same episode, the location was changed to a different state. The answer varies depending on which version of the episode you watch. Springfield has a confirmed location that is not the same confirmed location in different versions of the same episode. Even when the show gives you the answer changes based on context. Even the apparent resolution of the mystery participates in the mystery. Every state in America has been proposed as Springfield's true location at some point. Every proposal has evidence supporting it. Every proposal has contradictory evidence undermining it. The system is designed to be unresolvable, and it has been maintained in that state for 36 years. Springfield will never be located. The show made up its mind about this long ago. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone who has ever felt like they lived in a place like Springfield, regardless of where that place actually was. Everyone who lived near something industrial that they were told was safe. Everyone who noticed things that did not add up and was gently discouraged from looking too closely. Everyone who grew up in a community that had its own version of Burns, its own version of the plant, its own version of the social contract that says we do not ask certain questions here. Springfield belongs to those people. All of them, simultaneously. Making it belong to Oregon would mean taking it away from everyone else. And the show has always understood this, which is why the answer to where is Springfield remains and will remain wherever you feel it most. Section 10. The Floating Timeline. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December, 1989. Bart Simpson is 10 years old right now. In the 36 years between those two sentences, the world has been transformed beyond anything that would have been recognizable to someone watching the premiere. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. The internet went from a research tool to the infrastructure of daily existence. Mobile phones became the primary device through which most people in the developed world experience reality. Multiple wars began and ended. Multiple economic crises erupted and were absorbed. The entire texture of everyday life changed several times. In Springfield, Bart remained 10, Lisa remained 8, Maggie remained 1. Homer and Marge remained in their mid-30s. The house on Evergreen Terrace looked identical to how it looked in the pilot. The relationships had the same dynamics. The basic architecture of the Simpson family's daily existence stayed frozen at the moment the show began, while every external reference point updated around them to reflect the contemporary world. This is called a floating timeline. The show's present is always the viewer's present. The episode airing this week is set in this week, with this week's technology and cultural references and news context. But the characters do not update. They exist in a permanent present tense, living in an ever-advancing now while remaining unchanged within it. It is standard practice for long-running animated shows, and most people accept it as part of the format without sustained examination. Questioning it feels like asking why animated characters are drawn rather than filmed. It is just the convention. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has produced contradictions so large and so structurally significant that they have fractured the show's internal reality in ways that become visible when you look directly at them. The most obvious problem is Homer and Marge's history. When the show began, their relationship was anchored to the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. Their courtship was period-specific. Their formative experiences were grounded in a particular era, which made sense for a couple in their mid-30s during the late 1980s. The music of their adolescence was the music of that period. The cultural touchstones of their youth were from that time. As the floating timeline moved the present forward by a year, then another, then eventually a decade, their backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they were not teenagers in 1978. They were teenagers in approximately 2005, which means their formative experiences were shaped by early social media and smartphones rather than by Watergate and disco. The show has managed this by rewriting their origin story multiple times. There are now at least 4 substantially different versions of how they met and what their early relationship was like, each one placing their formative years in a different decade, each one discarding the previous version without ceremony. They have been counterculture figures, grunge-era figures, early millennials. Their history is not a fixed document. It is a sliding window that moves to stay calibrated with whatever decade is most plausible relative to the current episode. Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. They have successive drafts of a past, each written over the previous without acknowledgement. Within the logic of the show, this means the characters' own memories of their lives are unstable. The version of their courtship they would describe in 2025 is different from the version they would have described in 1995, not because they revised their understanding of what happened, but because the events themselves were retroactively changed around them. Springfield is a place where the past reshapes to accommodate the present, where memory is a plastic material rather than a reliable archive. This is, among other things, exactly what the principal and the pauper established as Springfield's operational logic. The past is whatever the community agrees it was. Memory is whatever version of events serves the current consensus. And anyone who insists on a fixed, stable account of what actually happened can expect to be removed from the conversation. The floating timeline is not a production convention that exists outside the show's internal world. It is the show's internal world expressing itself at the level of narrative structure. Springfield is a place where the past is permanently revisable, where history is whatever the present requires it to have been. Apply the full weight of every theory in this breakdown to this one fact. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen memory of a man who lost consciousness in 1993. Homer's brain cannot let his family grow older because it does not have the reference material to imagine them older. It knows them only as they were on the day the vending machine fell. The characters are preserved exactly as they were at that moment because that is all the dreaming brain can work from. The floating timeline is not a storytelling device. It is the structural expression of a mind that can only replay the moment it stopped and cannot move past it. The radiation theory says nobody ages because their biology has been altered by decades of exposure to nuclear contamination. Their cellular processes have been modified in ways that affect the mechanisms governing aging. They are not immortal. They are mutated in a way that makes the normal human relationship with time not apply to them the way it applies to people outside the contamination zone. The collective denial framework says nobody ages because Springfield collectively agrees to treat time as having not passed. The same social contract that makes Springfield vote to maintain a lie about who the principal is also makes Springfield vote implicitly and continuously to maintain the pretense that Bart is still 10 and Lisa is still 8 and everything is still as it was. The floating timeline is not a property of the show. It is a property of Springfield's relationship with truth. The show has proven it can imagine its characters aging. The Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding is a flash forward to 2010, showing Lisa as a 23-year-old woman living in London, engaged to be married, navigating adulthood with the specific combination of idealism and loneliness that the show had always implied she would carry into her grown-up life. The episode is emotionally complete. It is character true. It demonstrates conclusively that the show has the tools to tell the story of the Simpson children becoming adults. It declines to tell that story. The flash forward is a single episode, a glimpse through a window that immediately closes. Lisa returns to being 8. The future is locked away. The permanent present resumes. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And that refusal is where the floating timeline becomes something larger than a production convention or a narrative device, or even a symptom of Springfield's corrupted relationship with reality. The Simpsons are the American family, not an American family. The American family. They have been the primary fictional American household for longer than any other in the history of the medium. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, in the house on Evergreen Terrace, in the town that cannot be found on any map, in the show that will not end. For the floating timeline to stop floating would require the Simpson family to age. For the family to age would require Bart to go to college, Lisa to leave and become the adult the show has always known she would be, Maggie to speak and walk and become a person rather than a symbol. It would require Homer and Marge to be parents of grown children rather than young ones. It would require the house on Evergreen Terrace to become quieter than it has ever been in 36 years. That is not the story America wants from The Simpsons. The story America keeps choosing, every week it continues to watch, is the one where the kids are always young, and the parents are always together, and the house always looks the same, and the couch is always there, and the beer is always cold, and Homer is always stumbling through the door at the end of the day in a way that somehow always resolves into something that looks like, okay, we are here, we are together, this is enough. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement, its most honest declaration of what it is for. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them frozen, because they represent something we cannot afford to let change. The messy, loving, dysfunctional, indestructible American family that survives everything and resets after every disaster and keeps showing up on Sunday night no matter what happened during the week. They do not age because aging means ending. And the American family, in the imagination The Simpsons has been feeding and reflecting and shaping for 3.5 decades, is not allowed to end. It exists in perpetual present, cycling through the same dynamics, running the same loop, because the loop is what we built and what we maintain and what we tune in every week to confirm is still intact. The loop is not their prison, it is ours. We pressed pause on The Simpson family in 1989, and we have never pressed play. And now here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family in the same house, on the same impossible street, in the same town that cannot be located on any map. Watching Bart still get into trouble. Watching Lisa still fight for a world that is not ready for her. Watching Homer still come through that door. Watching Marge watch him with that expression she has, the one that means I love you and you exhaust me in equal measure, and I would not trade this for anything, waiting for something to change, knowing nothing will. Because we will not let it. Because letting The Simpsons change means admitting that we have changed. That the couch we watched this on when we were younger is somewhere else now, or gone entirely. That the years have passed in the real world even while they stood still in Springfield. As long as the show keeps running, as long as the loop keeps floating, we do not have to admit that. We can just go home, to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never ages, in the town that never ends. Section 11. Hans Moleman's death count and the truth about Ned Flanders. 2 final mysteries before we close, and they are briefer than what has come before, but they have been sitting in the background of the show for decades, accumulating evidence that most viewers have absorbed without examining. The first is a man who has been dying on a regular schedule for 30 years. The second is the most quietly devastating character study The Simpsons has ever produced, hidden inside the show's most relentlessly cheerful person, Hans Moleman. If you have watched The Simpsons for any meaningful length of time, you know him. The tiny, hunched, nearly blind man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists within the logic of the show primarily to suffer. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets buried alive. He gets attacked by animals. He gets struck by lightning. He is incinerated. He walks into traffic and does not come back from it. He drowns. He falls from heights that should be fatal. He is, by any reasonable count, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. Not in Halloween specials, not in dream sequences, in standard canonical Simpsons episodes. Hans Moleman dies. Then Hans Moleman appears in the next episode completely fine, with no explanation offered and no acknowledgement that he was dead 2 episodes ago. Most viewers absorb this as a running gag. Moleman dies a lot, the show commits to the bit. Moving on. But under the frameworks we have been working with throughout this breakdown, his repeated deaths become something more interesting than a recurring joke. If the radiation theory is true, Moleman represents the most extreme mutation in Springfield. A man whose biology has been so thoroughly altered by prolonged environmental exposure that his body can reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. Homer endures damage and recovers. Homer's resilience operates below the threshold of actual death. Moleman crosses that threshold and comes back. His mutation affects whatever biological processes govern cellular death and regeneration in a way that makes death a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. He is not resilient. He is regenerative. If the coma theory is true, Moleman is a background process in Homer's dream, a peripheral character that the dreaming mind needs for the simulation to feel populated, but does not maintain with the same consistency it maintains the major figures. Minor characters in dreams are unstable. When the dream no longer needs Moleman in his current form, he lapses. When the next scene needs someone in that corner of the frame, the dream reassembles him. He dies because Homer's unconscious mind occasionally lets him lapse, and he returns because the simulation requires a certain density of background characters to feel like a real town. If the collective denial framework applies, Moleman's deaths are simply one more item on the list of things Springfield has agreed not to notice or discuss. A man dies in public, visibly, repeatedly in front of witnesses. Nobody investigates. Nobody calls for inquiry. Nobody asks the basic question of how someone keeps coming back from events that were documented as fatal. The town has normalized his death cycle with the same efficiency it normalized the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire and the human bones in the plant's basement. There is a detail about Moleman that lands differently once you take him seriously as evidence rather than background texture. He stated his age once as 31 years old. Look at him. Hans Moleman appears to be in his 80s. His face is deeply lined. His back is bent to a significant degree. He moves with the deliberate slowness of someone whose body is in significant decline. He is, visually, the picture of extreme old age. He is 31 years old. Something aged Hans Moleman catastrophically. Something took a man in the earliest part of his adult life and compressed decades of physical deterioration into him well ahead of schedule. The radiation theory has an explanation for this. The same contamination that altered other residents differently may have specifically and dramatically accelerated his aging process, in the same way it supercharged Maggie's cognitive function while compromising Homer's. Different individuals, different mutations, different expressions of the same underlying cause. The combination of premature aging and apparent regenerative capacity is strange together. Something made him ancient before his time. Something also made him unable to stay dead. Both outcomes could be expressions of the same source. The same contamination that produces different mutations in different people produced these particular mutations in him simultaneously. He is 31. He looks 90. He has died more times than any other character in the show's history, and he keeps appearing in the background of the next scene, ready to absorb whatever the episode needs to drop on him. With the particular dignity of a man who has accepted that his situation is unusual without having found a way to change it. Every theory in this breakdown has an explanation for Hans Moleman. The only framework that does not is the one that says he is just a running gag, and none of this is meant to mean anything. Now, Ned Flanders. Ned is everything Homer is not. Patient, generous, devoutly religious, physically fit, financially responsible, a good father, a considerate neighbor. By any objective standard applied to the show's characters, Ned is a better person than Homer in most of the categories that matter. And the show punishes him for it with a consistency so steady and so comprehensive that it stops feeling like misfortune and starts feeling like structural. His wife Maud was killed at the Springfield Speedway when a t-shirt cannon misfired during a racing event. Homer was in the crowd. He was dodging the t-shirts because he wanted to avoid getting hit by them, which altered the trajectory of one shirt so that it hit Maud instead of Homer. Homer's reflexive selfishness in a trivial, thoughtless moment directly caused the death of his neighbor's wife. And Ned forgave him, because Ned always forgives. He turns the other cheek. He absorbs loss and grief and the particular devastation of knowing how his wife died, and he responds with grace, because that is what his faith requires of him, and because Ned is, as the show has always presented him, a genuinely good person trying to live a genuinely good life. Here is where the show's treatment of Ned becomes more unsettling than its surface presentation suggests. When a hurricane destroys Ned's house and the community rebuilds it with such total incompetence that it collapses almost immediately, Ned has a breakdown. Not a mild frustration, a complete psychological unraveling. He screams at the town. He says things about everyone who has ever wronged him that he has clearly been holding inside for a very long time, things that are accurate and earned and that the show has been quietly implying for seasons. He articulates a rage that nobody around him knew was there. And then he is committed to a mental health facility. In the facility, the revelation comes. Ned's relentless niceness is not an organic character trait. It is the product of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, committed to a philosophy of non-intervention, brought him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive behavioral work. The treatment succeeded. The rage was suppressed so thoroughly that adult Ned cannot fully access it. His patience with Homer is not saintliness. It is a psychological cage built around a person who was reprogrammed before he was old enough to participate in the decision. Every element of Ned reads differently once you understand this. His patience is the conditioned inability to feel what he should feel about what Homer does to his life. His forgiveness of Homer for Maude's death is not spiritual achievement. It is the programmed response of a man whose brain will not allow the alternative, because the alternative was trained out of him in childhood. His faith is not only genuine conviction, though some of it may be. It is also a coping mechanism for a man who needs an external framework to explain why he keeps absorbing pain that he cannot respond to with the emotional repertoire a person in his situation would naturally have. His faith tells him the suffering is part of a plan he cannot see. It gives the unexpressed emotions somewhere to go. It makes the grief and the frustration and the accumulated weight of decades of being the good neighbor to a man who killed your wife and who will never fully understand what he took from you into something that can be carried rather than something that dismantles you. The show has given God actual presence in the Simpsons universe. God is not a metaphor in this show. God appears in episodes. God has face-to-face conversations with characters as real events within the show's logic. God intervenes in Springfield's affairs in ways the show treats as genuine divine action. One of the characters God has spoken to most directly and most often is Homer Simpson. Homer, the man who sleeps through church, the man who famously decided to stop attending church because Sunday mornings at home were better, the man whose relationship with organized religion is characterized by inattention and the occasional accidental prayer. Homer has had genuine, responsive, face-to-face conversations with God across multiple episodes. Ned Flanders has devoted his life to faith. He attends church without exception. He prays with genuine intention. He has structured his entire existence around his relationship with God. He has lost his wife and his house and his psychological stability and continued to believe through all of it. He has asked every Sunday morning for the acknowledgement that what he is doing matters. God has never spoken to Ned. The drunk who falls asleep during services gets divine conversation. The devout man who has given everything his faith asks of him gets silence. This is not a continuity oversight. The Simpsons is deliberate about its use of God as a character. The choice to have God speak to Homer and not Ned is a statement about what Springfield rewards and what it withholds. About the relationship between goodness and outcome in a universe that does not appear to operate on the principle that good behavior is protected from bad results. Ned does everything right. He follows every rule. He extends grace to people who have given him no reason to. He has maintained his faith through losses that would have broken a person with a less rigidly constructed psychological architecture. He is, by the show's own internal criteria, the best person in Springfield. And Springfield does not care. The system does not reward Ned. It takes from him and withholds from him and watches him absorb it with the particular efficiency of a man who was conditioned to absorb it before he was old enough to choose. His compliance, his relentless goodness, his inability to resist or push back or feel what he should feel, these make him useful to the system rather than protected by it. He exists within the loop. He does not challenge the loop, he asks nothing. He endures everything. He receives nothing. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that does not punish wrongness. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them has not closed. The system produces that gap and the system maintains it, because the gap is structural. Homer's chaos keeps the town moving. Ned's compliance keeps the moral accounting from demanding anything. Together they form a stable arrangement in which nothing changes and nothing is required to change. That is Springfield. That is every mystery and contradiction and impossible element we have spent tonight exploring, reduced to its clearest form. A town where nothing changes, where nobody grows, where the same family sits on the same couch in the same house every week, cycling through the same loop, and next door, the same good neighbor absorbs the same losses with the same patient grace, and the sky is silent above him, and he keeps asking, closing. We have spent 4 hours in Springfield. We followed the radiation from the cracked cooling towers into the water supply, and from the water supply into the biology of every person who lives downwind. We walked through Homer's coma and watched everything since April 1993 become the dream of an unconscious man who cannot stop wanting his family back. We reopened the Burns shooting and found a case that was filed rather than solved. We mapped Burns's impossible survival onto a system of weekly treatments and engineered immortality, and the particular durability of something that is too expensive to die. We watched a town vote unanimously to exile truth from its own community and make honesty a punishable offense. We sat behind Maggie's eyes and found something extraordinary building in 36 years of strategic silence. We counted the predictions, explained the mechanism behind them, and found a show that may have shaped the future it appeared to predict. We followed Mona Simpson from 1969 to her death, and traced the wreckage her absence left across 3 generations of the same family. We searched for Springfield on every map and found it everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And we stared at the floating timeline until the permanence of Springfield's present resolved into what it actually is. A cultural wish, a collective pause button, a need that millions of people have been expressing every week since 1989 by continuing to watch. Every theory in this breakdown uses different evidence and different logic, but they all arrive at the same observation. Something is structurally wrong in Springfield. Whether the explanation is radiation or dream, or collective denial, or the accumulated consequence of one billionaire's decision to prioritize his interests over every living thing in the community he owns, something has broken the normal relationship between cause and consequence, between time and change, between what people see and what they understand about what they are seeing. And the show has been telling you about this breakage since the first episode, not through dramatic exposition, through accumulation, through the patient layering of detail upon detail across decades, until the picture becomes impossible to honestly deny. The Simpsons is not hiding its mysteries. It is displaying them every week, showing you the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire and the bones in the basement and the baby with the gun and the town that voted to exile its own truth. It shows you all of it, and then the episode ends, and next week everything is fine again, because Springfield has agreed, once more, to not look at it. And we look away with it, because we built the loop. We maintain it. We tune in every week to confirm that the walls are still standing and the family is still there and the timeline is still floating. And as long as The Simpsons keeps running, as long as Homer keeps coming home, as long as the beer is still cold and the house still looks the same and Bart is still 10 years old, we do not have to admit how much time has passed in the world outside it. We can just go home, to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. Good night. End of script. The episode Behind the Laughter and its shifting location is worth thinking through as a specific case study in how Springfield handles attempts to pin down facts about itself. The episode was designed as a mockumentary, a form that implies commitment to a particular kind of documentary truth. Mockumentaries work by borrowing the visual and structural conventions of documentaries, which carry an implicit claim to be reporting real things about the real world, and using those conventions to create a sustained joke, about the gap between documentary style and the fictional content being documented. The format is inherently about the relationship between presentation and truth. Behind the Laughter uses this format to tell the story of the Simpsons as though they were a real family whose life had been documented. It presents facts about them, including the apparently definitive fact of their location, and then, in syndication, it changes one of those facts. The location that was stated as a fact in the original broadcast is replaced with a different location in the rerun. This is extraordinary behavior for a television production. Continuity changes happen between productions. A location established in one episode might be quietly ignored in a later one. But actively changing the content of an episode between original broadcast and syndication is a deliberate choice to undermine the authority of the stated fact. It is the show saying explicitly that even in an episode specifically designed to reveal truths about the Simpson family's world, the truths it reveals are not stable. They change depending on context. The episode where Springfield's location was most directly stated is the episode where the statement is most directly undermined. The mockumentary that claims to be a documentary is also the episode that demonstrates most clearly that Springfield's documented reality is contingent rather than fixed. This is not an accident of production. This is the show performing, at the level of production decision, the same thing that the principal and the pauper depicts at the level of narrative. The past is whatever the current moment requires it to be. The stated facts change when the context changes. The truth, if there is a truth, is the thing that nobody can quite point to because every time someone gets close to pointing, the arrow moves. Springfield's geography is undefined for the same reason Springfield's history is unstable. Both serve the same function, to ensure that there is no fixed ground from which to launch a definitive investigation into what the town is and what it has been doing. Regulatory jurisdiction requires a fixed location. Historical accountability requires a stable record. Springfield has neither, not by accident, but by the continuous operation of a system that produces ambiguity wherever ambiguity is useful. The thing that makes this worth examining carefully is that the ambiguity is not passive. The show does not simply decline to state Springfield's location. It actively plants false leads and contradicts them. It gives you a location and then takes it back. It creates the appearance of a mystery being constructed in good faith and then refuses to provide the resolution that would be required for a good faith mystery. The active nature of the ambiguity suggests that its function is not just aesthetic, not just about maintaining a universal feel, but about ensuring that the question cannot be definitively answered no matter how carefully it is approached. A show that wanted Springfield to be geographically universal would simply not address the question. A show that actively creates and then undermines geographic clues is doing something more deliberate. It is maintaining a condition, not just a convention. The condition it is maintaining is unlocatability, and unlocatability, for a facility with 342 safety violations operating in a town classified as a federal environmental hazard, is very useful indeed. The way Homer and Marge's backstory shifts across the show's run is the clearest example of the floating timeline in operation, and it is worth tracing in more detail because the shifts are not random. They are calibrated to maintain a specific relationship between Homer and Marge's formative experiences and the experiences of the show's current audience. When the show began, Homer and Marge's adolescence was grounded in the late 1970s. They attended a prom. The music was the music of that era. The cultural references were the cultural references of that time. This was calibrated for 1,989 viewers, for whom the late 1970s represented a recent enough past to feel personally resonant, a shared cultural memory they could connect to. As the show continued into the 1990s and then the 2000s, and eventually the 2010s, the late 1970s became increasingly distant history for the viewing audience. A teenager in 1989, remembering the late 1970s, has a very different relationship to that period than a teenager in 2010 does. The reference no longer activates personal resonance. It activates historical distance. The prom that felt like a shared memory becomes a museum piece. The show responds to this by moving the backstory forward. Homer and Marge's adolescence becomes the 1990s. Their prom becomes a 1990s prom. Their cultural references become 1990s cultural references. The details change, but the emotional shape of the story remains. They were young, they met, they fell in love, they chose each other. The story is structurally identical across all its versions. Only the era changes. This is not the show making mistakes or failing to maintain continuity. It is the show deliberately sacrificing historical continuity to maintain emotional continuity. The specific details of when Homer and Marge were teenagers are less important than whether viewers can find themselves in the story of their becoming. The floating backstory keeps the emotional core of the relationship accessible to new audiences by updating its cultural context. But the consequence of this is that Homer and Marge do not have a real past. They have a functional past. A past that does what a past needs to do, which is explain how they became who they are, without being committed to any specific historical facts that might constrain how the present can be configured. The past is always available for revision if the present requires different facts from it. This is the coma theory in miniature. Homer's brain cannot generate a past that has fixed, stable facts because the dream does not have a reliable archive of what the past actually contained. It has impressions and emotional resonances and the felt sense of what the past was like, but the specific details are available for reconfiguration based on what the current moment needs. The backstory shifts because the memory is working from impressions rather than facts. It is also the collective denial framework in miniature. Springfield does not commit to a fixed version of Homer and Marge's past because committing to a fixed version would eventually create contradictions with the present that could not be easily resolved. Better to keep the past flexible, available for adjustment, not too pinned down in any direction that might become inconvenient. The floating timeline is not just about the characters' ages, it is about the entire relationship between Springfield's past and Springfield's present. The past is whatever the present requires it to be. History is a resource to be drawn from as needed rather than a fixed record to be respected as authoritative. And the town that maintains this relationship with its own history is a town that has permanently removed the possibility of a specific kind of accountability, the kind that comes from being able to say definitively what happened and when and who was responsible. Burns has been doing this for over a century. The town has been doing it for 36 seasons of television. The backstory shifts because Springfield, as a place, does not permit fixed histories. The emotional cost of this arrangement is paid mostly by Homer and Marge, who cannot have a genuine shared history because their shared history is always available for revision. The years they have spent together, the experiences that have shaped who they are to each other, the memories that would give their relationship its specific texture and depth, all of this is permanently unstable. Any of it can be changed. Any of it has probably been changed. The foundation of their relationship is built on material that is explicitly understood to be revisable on demand. The show depicts their love as genuine and enduring across all the revisions. This is, in its way, the most optimistic thing the show has ever claimed. That love persists not because its history is stable, but despite the fact that its history is not. That the emotional truth of a relationship can survive the narrative truth being continuously rewritten around it. That something real can exist inside a structure that is permanently provisional. Whether this is true or comforting or devastating depends on how you hold it. Under the coma theory, it is devastating. Homer and Marge's relationship persists across the revisions because it exists inside Homer's dream, where the emotional truth is the only truth that matters, and the specific historical facts are just the dream's attempt to provide context for a feeling that exists independently of them. The love is real within the dream. The history it is built on is always a construction. And Homer, dreaming in his hospital bed, keeps rebuilding it because the feeling it supports is the thing he cannot bring himself to let go of. The parallel between Hans Moleman and Burns, that the show almost never makes explicit, is worth drawing out, because it illuminates something about the range of outcomes that Springfield's contamination produces. Burns regenerates through managed technological intervention. His continued existence is the product of a precisely calibrated system of treatments that maintain his biological function at significant cost and with zero margin for error. He is indestructible in the sense that the system maintaining him is very good at what it does, but he is not indestructible in any fundamental biological sense. Remove the system and he dies. Moleman regenerates through something else. Through whatever his biology has become after decades of exposure to Springfield's particular contamination at close range, his regeneration is not managed. It is not the product of external intervention or expensive pharmaceutical treatment. It appears to be intrinsic, a modification of his biological processes at a level deep enough to make death a condition he recovers from rather than a state he remains in. This is a more extreme mutation than anything Burns has achieved through technology. Burns is being kept alive. Moleman is coming back to life. The distinction matters because it represents a different relationship between organism and mortality. Burns's treatments prevent death from occurring. Moleman's biology reverses it after it has occurred. These are not the same thing. If the radiation theory is correct, Moleman represents what the plant's contamination can do to a human body without the management layer that Burns applies. Burns's wealth insulates him from the raw effects of the contamination while allowing him to absorb its benefits. He can take what is useful, the radiation that powers his weekly treatments, while managing the harmful effects through pharmaceutical intervention. He has built a technological buffer between himself and unmanaged exposure. Moleman has no such buffer. He is a Springfield resident living in the contaminated environment without access to the resources that would let him manage the exposure. Whatever the plant has done to his biology has been unmediated, direct, the product of decades of exposure without buffer. And the result is something more extreme than anything Burns's careful management has produced. Moleman is not being kept alive by technology. Moleman is, in some way the show never explains, simply not staying dead. This suggests a disturbing implication. The managed exposure that Burns uses to maintain himself may be producing a more conservative modification than the unmanaged exposure that Springfield's residents absorb. Burns's careful calibration achieves longevity within the parameters of normal biological function. The unmanaged contamination that Moleman represents achieves something more radical, a modification of whatever biological processes make death permanent. If this is true, then the rest of Springfield's population is somewhere on the spectrum between Burns and Moleman. Not as extreme as Moleman, because Moleman represents decades of close-range, unmanaged exposure that most residents do not experience. Not as managed as Burns, because most residents lack the resources for his calibrated intervention. Somewhere between the two. Modified in ways that the show depicts as the baseline normal for Springfield. The yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the impossible resilience, the extended lifespans that the floating timeline produces. By making the characters not age, the entire population of Springfield may be slowly moving in the direction of Moleman, accumulating biological modifications across generations, developing a relationship with their own biology that increasingly differs from what exists outside the contamination zone. Moleman at 31 years old, looking 90, might be a preview of what happens when that accumulation concentrates in a single person rather than distributing across the population. He is not an anomaly. He is an extreme expression of something the whole town is experiencing at lesser intensity. Burns, managing his exposure carefully from the top of the economic pyramid, has produced the most controlled version of what this contamination can do. Moleman, living at the bottom without buffers, has produced the most uncontrolled version, and everyone else in Springfield is somewhere on the spectrum between them, modified in ways they cannot perceive because they have nothing to compare themselves against. Now, the final thoughts on Ned. The thing about Ned's faith that deserves the most attention is not the silence from God. It is what Ned does with the silence. He keeps praying. He keeps attending church. He keeps extending grace to the people around him who have been taking from him continuously for decades. He keeps forgiving Homer. He keeps being the good neighbor. He keeps doing all the things that his faith tells him to do, in the complete absence of any evidence from the framework his faith is based on that these actions are seen or valued or protected. This is not stupidity. This is not even naivety. This is a commitment to a set of behaviors that Ned has decided are worth maintaining regardless of what they produce. He is not praying because he expects results. He gave up expecting results at some point, probably during the processing he did in the mental health facility, or in the quiet period after Maud's death. He is praying because the practice of praying is what keeps the conditioned suppression of his anger in place. The rituals of faith are the cage. Without them, whatever was behind the rage he expressed during the hurricane episode is closer to the surface. Ned is not faithful because faith gives him something. Ned is faithful because faith is what stands between him and the version of himself that his childhood conditioning was designed to prevent. The faith is functional. not in the sense of producing divine response, but in the sense of maintaining the psychological architecture that keeps the conditioned Ned in place over the rage-prone child beneath him. This is very dark. It is also, on reflection, a recognizable human situation. Many people maintain practices and beliefs not because those practices and beliefs produce demonstrable results, but because the practices and beliefs are what makes them the person they are trying to be rather than the person they would be. Without them, the content of the belief matters less than its structural function. Ned is not a religious hypocrite. He is a person whose religion is the most functional tool available to him for managing a psychological architecture that he did not choose and cannot dismantle without losing himself. The show does not condemn Ned for this. It is too honest about human complexity to condemn someone for finding the most functional available mechanism for managing their own inner life. What the show does is notice it, and by placing Ned next door to Homer, by making them the show's central contrast for 36 years, it creates a sustained examination of two different relationships to the same absence of meaningful, external validation. Homer does not pray. Homer does not expect the universe to recognize his goodness. Homer does not have a theological framework for understanding why bad things happen to him. Homer operates without a structure that explains his suffering in terms of a larger plan. And as a result, he experiences his suffering as random and processes it the same way he processes everything, with a brief burst of distress followed by a reset. The suffering does not accumulate for Homer in the way it accumulates for Ned, because Homer does not have a framework that makes accumulated suffering meaningful. Ned accumulates. Every loss is filed in the framework. Every unanswered prayer is evidence of either a plan he cannot see or a worthiness question he cannot resolve. The framework that makes his suffering meaningful also makes it impossible to put down. Homer forgets. Ned remembers. And the universe, as the show depicts it, does not distinguish between the two in how it treats them. The same absence of divine attention applies to both. The random distribution of good and bad outcomes applies to both. The reset that makes Evergreen Terrace the same at the beginning of every episode applies to both. But Ned carries the weight of everything in a way Homer cannot, because Ned has the architecture to carry it, and Homer has the architecture that makes him forget. Which of them has the better deal is a question the show leaves open. It is the kind of question that does not have an answer that can be stated simply, or that everyone who considers it will arrive at from the same direction. But the show puts them next door to each other and lets us watch both of them, every episode, and lets us decide what we think about what we see. That is, in the end, what The Simpsons has always been doing, showing us the thing and letting us decide what it means. What makes the theories in this breakdown something more than academic exercises in overthinking a cartoon is that they converge. They start from different premises and use different evidence and work through different logical pathways, and they all arrive at the same place. Springfield is broken, the breaking is structural, and the people inside the breaking do not know it because the breaking is also what impairs their ability to know it. This is the most interesting thing the radiation theory, the coma theory, the collective denial framework, and the immortality question all share. Each one describes a situation where the mechanism of the damage is also the mechanism that prevents the damage from being perceived. The contamination that alters Springfield's residents also alters their capacity to recognize the alteration. The dream that Homer is living is also the thing that prevents him from knowing he is dreaming. The collective denial that Springfield performs is also what prevents the individuals within it from recognizing that they are performing denial. The accumulation of wealth and power that keeps Burns alive also keeps the rest of Springfield in the condition that makes them easy to maintain in that state. These are not separate problems that happen to share a setting. They are the same problem described from 4 different angles. The town is inside the thing that is affecting it, which means the town does not have the perspective required to see the thing clearly. And the thing that is affecting the town is also the thing that prevents the town from developing that perspective. This is the structure that makes Springfield resistant to change in a way that goes beyond the normal reasons television shows resist change. It is not just that the episodic format requires a reset. It is not just that the floating timeline prevents aging. It is that Springfield has been built, deliberately or through the accumulation of the show's own internal logic, into a system that regenerates its own stability by continuously undermining the conditions that would allow it to be changed. Burns needs the contamination to continue because the contamination produces the population he needs. The population's contamination impairs their capacity to challenge the contamination. The denial that covers the contamination is produced by a community whose contamination has impaired their capacity to process the evidence the denial is concealing. The dream that Homer is living prevents him from waking up to the situation the dream is constructed to avoid. And we, the audience, are inside this too. Not in the same sense. We are not contaminated, we are not dreaming. But we have absorbed Springfield into our imaginations with sufficient depth that its specific way of understanding the world has become one of the lenses we use to understand our own. We have been watching it for 36 years, and it has, during that time, been changing what we see when we look at things. The best theories about The Simpsons are not the ones that solve something about the show. They are the ones that use the show to illuminate something about the watching, about why we keep watching, about what we are looking for when we return to Evergreen Terrace, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, checking to confirm that the house still looks the same and the family is still there and the loop is still running. We are looking for something that the show has always understood about us even when we do not understand it about ourselves. We are looking for the thing that does not change. We are looking for home. And Springfield, impossible and contaminated and dreamed and denied, in a state with no name on a map that does not exist, keeps being there. That is the real mystery. Not what is wrong with Springfield, but why that is where we keep going when we need to find the thing we cannot lose. The cognitive dimension of the contamination theory is where the argument becomes most self-reinforcing and most difficult to escape from once you have seen it clearly. The specific effect of radiation exposure on brain tissue is well documented in the scientific literature outside the show. Radiation affects dividing cells preferentially, and the brain's development depends on precisely timed cellular division, particularly during early childhood. Radiation exposure during developmental windows can produce persistent cognitive effects that do not look like damage from the outside. They look like the person's baseline. They look like who that person simply is. Homer's IQ of 55 is not presented by the show as obviously abnormal. The other Springfield residents treat it as Homer's characteristic. His family, his neighbors, his employer, they all relate to Homer's cognitive limitations as simply part of Homer's personality rather than as the result of an external cause. The show's own framing treats Homer's intelligence as a fixed trait of his character rather than as a modification of what he might have been. The crayon revelation is the only moment where the show allows itself to suggest that Homer's intelligence is not his natural state, but a managed outcome. When the crayon is removed, Homer becomes someone different. Not unrecognizable, not a stranger, but someone operating at a genuinely different cognitive level. He thinks more quickly. He reasons more carefully. He makes connections that the crayon Homer could not make. He writes a nuclear safety report that demonstrates a technical understanding of his own workplace that his day-to-day behavior has never reflected. This Homer, crayon-free Homer, is the person who would have existed if the development of his brain had not been physically interrupted. He is the counterfactual that the show briefly allows to exist before Homer chooses to close it off. And the reason Homer closes it off is as revealing as the counterfactual itself. He cannot be that Homer in Springfield. Being that Homer, seeing Springfield with clarity, understanding what his job is and what his employer is, and what the system he has been inside for his entire adult life is designed to do to him, is unbearable. Not because the knowledge is abstractly terrible, though it is terrible, because the knowledge is actionable. It demands something from him. It demands that he respond to his situation in a way that aligns with what he now understands his situation to be. And the response his understanding would demand is impossible in Springfield. You cannot change Springfield from inside Springfield. You cannot challenge Burns from inside the economic structure that Burns controls. You cannot fix the violations that Homer's safety report identified from the position of the man whose job is to not fix them. The clarity is real, but it produces no available action. The understanding is accurate, but it has no outlet. The intelligence that was returned to Homer by the crayon's removal reveals a situation that Homer, now intelligent enough to see clearly, is still too embedded in to change. So he puts the crayon back. He chooses the fog. Because the fog is the only thing that makes the situation livable. This is not cowardice in any simple sense. It is a rational response to a specific kind of entrapment. Homer can see the cage now. He cannot leave the cage. The choice to stop seeing the cage is the only remaining option. But the question the show never asks, the question that hovers over the entire Crayon storyline, is whether Homer's entrapment would have been as complete if the cage had been built differently. If the contamination had not been compromising his brain since childhood, if Abe had not made the deal with Burns, if the medical establishment in Springfield had found the crayon years ago, if any of the systems that are supposed to protect people from this kind of entrapment had been functioning rather than compromised. Homer is in the cage partly because his intelligence was compromised before he was old enough to know it was being compromised. The cage was built while he was inside it and before he understood what a cage was. By the time the crayon is removed and he can see clearly, the cage is complete and the exit was sealed decades ago. The contamination does not merely reduce intelligence, it reduces the intelligence of the people who would need intelligence to recognize and respond to the contamination. It produces the specific cognitive impairment that is most useful to the system producing the contamination. This is not conspiracy in the intentional design sense, though Burns's deliberate employment of Homer suggests intentionality at least at that level. It is the functional outcome of a feedback loop between a contamination source and a contaminated population that has operated long enough to reach a stable equilibrium. Springfield's population is approximately as cognitively compromised as they need to be to not threaten the system that is compromising them. Not so compromised that they cannot function. Not compromised enough to effectively challenge the source of the compromise. Right at the level where they can live their lives and go to work and drink the water and breathe the air and look at the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire and the human skeletons in the basement and conclude, each time, that everything is basically fine. That is the contamination's masterwork, not the mutations, not the altered biology, the conclusion. The ongoing, continuously regenerated conclusion that everything is basically fine. That is what the plant produces that has the most value to the person who runs the plant. The contamination does not make Springfield's residents stupid enough to be useless. It makes them exactly stupid enough to be safe. There is a scene in the coma episode, in the 7 weeks where Homer is unconscious, that the show depicts from a specific angle. His family is there. They are sitting in the chairs beside his bed. They are waiting. The episode does not show us much of this, because the episode is structured around the comedy of the escalating pranks and then the physical incident and then the resolution, but it acknowledges that the waiting happened. 7 weeks of a family in chairs beside an unconscious man, wondering if he is coming back. If the coma theory is true, then Homer dreamed during those 7 weeks, not the full dream. The full dream begins at the point where his brain decides, consciously or otherwise, that consciousness is not something it is willing to return to yet. The 7 weeks are the threshold, the beginning of the long choosing to stay under. What does a brain dream about? In the first 7 weeks of an unexpected coma, in the period before the dreaming intelligence has fully committed to sustaining itself, before the dream has achieved the elaborate stability that produces 32 more years of Simpsons, probably exactly what Homer dreams about every time the show reminds us what he cares about most. Marge, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, the house, the specific quality of his life before the vending machine fell, the things he would lose if he did not wake up. The early seasons, the ones directly following the coma, are full of stories about Homer trying to be a good father, about Homer trying to save his marriage, about Homer failing at things that matter to him and finding his way back to the family that he cannot afford to lose. The emotional core of those seasons, which everyone agrees are the show's best, is the specific anxiety of a man who knows he is not enough and keeps trying anyway. Under the coma theory, that anxiety is Homer dreaming about what he is afraid he has already lost. He is dreaming about trying to be the father and husband he was afraid he had never quite been. He is dreaming about the stakes, about what matters, about the things he would have to become if he had the chance to become them. And in the dream, he gets to try. He gets to keep failing and keep trying. He gets to discover, episode after episode, that the family is still there and still his. As the dream goes on, as the brain's functional capacity diminishes and the emotional urgency of the early period fades, the dream loses its grip on those stakes. It generates bigger scenarios, more spectacle, more events, because the quieter emotional engines that drove the early seasons are running low. The dream compensates for depth with scale. It fills the space where feeling used to be with elaborateness. But even in the later seasons, in the most absurd and celebrity-filled and plot-driven episodes, the ending is the same. Homer comes home. The family is still there. Evergreen Terrace still looks exactly as it did when he fell asleep. Whatever happened in the episode, whatever impossible thing he survived or witnessed or participated in, by the final act he is back on the couch, back at the kitchen table, back in the configuration that the dream needs to be in to sustain itself. The ending never changes because the dream cannot afford for the ending to change. The ending is the reason the dream is running. It is the thing the dream is working to maintain. Homer's unconscious mind will generate increasingly elaborate scenarios for the middle of each episode because that is what dreams do when they are running out of source material. But it will not change the ending, because changing the ending would mean acknowledging that something has been lost, that the family is not how Homer left them, that the house is not as it was. The dream is not trying to tell a story. The dream is trying to maintain a feeling, and the feeling is, everything is okay. The family is here. Nothing has been lost yet. There is still time. That feeling is what the show produces in its audience as well. Not the analytical framework, not the theories, the feeling, the reliable weekly feeling that you can go back to Evergreen Terrace and everything is still okay and the family is still there and no one has had to say goodbye. We watch for the same reason Homer dreams, because the feeling is worth more than we can easily explain, because the thing it preserves, or the thing it simulates the preservation of, is something we cannot afford to have be over. The way the vote happens in The Principal and The Pauper deserves careful attention because it is not depicted as a coerced outcome. Nobody in Springfield is being forced to vote the way they vote. There is no threat of punishment for voting to acknowledge the truth. There is no economic pressure explicitly applied by Burns or any other authority figure. The vote is, in the most straightforward sense, a genuine expression of the community's collective preference. They want the lie, not because they are being made to want it, because the lie is better for them than the truth would be. This is the most uncomfortable element of the episode, and the one that has made it so persistently upsetting to fans. It would be easier if Springfield were being forced into the decision. It would be easier if Burns were pulling strings, or Wiggum were threatening people, or some external authority were imposing the outcome on a reluctant community. Then the episode would be about power being exercised over people, rather than being about the people themselves. But the episode is about the people themselves. They vote freely, they choose freely. They decide, without coercion, that the truth is less valuable to them than the arrangement the truth would disrupt. The episode is depicting something real about communities and about the choices communities make when faced with uncomfortable facts. Communities are not automatically oriented toward truth. They are oriented toward stability, toward the preservation of the arrangements they have built their lives around. When facts threaten those arrangements, communities frequently find ways to accommodate the facts that minimize disruption, rather than ways to accommodate the disruption that honesty would require. This is not unique to Springfield. This is a documented pattern of community behavior across different kinds of communities facing different kinds of inconvenient facts. The mechanism is the same every time. The community has built something on a foundation it now knows is uncertain. The cost of rebuilding on a different foundation is high. The cost of pretending the foundation is fine is lower in the short term. The community votes, explicitly or implicitly, to pretend. Springfield just votes explicitly. That is what makes the episode so uncomfortable. It makes visible the choice that most communities make implicitly between their actions and their rhetoric, between what they know and what they say they know. Springfield holds a meeting and says out loud what most communities say only through the absence of action. And the show frames it not as a failure of Springfield specifically, but as an expression of something that Springfield embodies more clearly than it usually has the honesty to admit. The episode is not saying that Springfield is uniquely cowardly or uniquely dishonest. It is saying that what Springfield does in this episode is what Springfield does in every episode, and what most communities do in most situations where the truth is inconvenient enough. The vote is just the moment when the camera stays in the room long enough to see the decision being made. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years. In that time, it has become something that does not have an obvious precedent in television history. Not just the longest-running scripted primetime show, something more specific than that. the longest-running version of a particular American domestic mythology that the medium has ever produced. The domestic mythology that The Simpsons embodies is a specific one. It is not the idealized American family of the 1950s sitcom, where the household is orderly and the problems are resolved and the father knows best. It is not the dysfunctional American family of the ironic 1990s approach, where the dysfunction is the point and the warmth is something to be suspicious of. It is something more complicated and more resilient than either. It is the messy, lovable, frequently catastrophic, ultimately enduring American family that keeps coming back to the couch together even after everything. This particular mythology has found its most durable expression in Springfield. And the fact of its durability is the most important thing about it. Other shows have depicted similar families and similar dynamics. None of them have run for 36 years. None of them have achieved the specific kind of cultural saturation that The Simpsons has achieved, where the show itself has become a cultural artifact in the way that certain songs or buildings become cultural artifacts, where it is part of the background of American life rather than a thing people watch occasionally. The Simpsons is background now. It has been background for long enough that people who have never particularly watched it carry images from it, reference frames from it, the specific visual language of it. When someone who has not watched the show in a decade encounters a headline that resembles something Springfield once depicted, they have the association because they cannot not have it. The show has been too present, too pervasive, too long-running not to be part of the way Americans understand American things. This is a form of cultural presence that is almost impossible to achieve intentionally. It requires time and consistency, and the specific quality of having touched something real about the lives of the people watching it for long enough that the touching leaves a permanent residue. The floating timeline is the mechanism that makes this possible. If the Simpson family aged, the mythology would age with them. Bart at 46 is not the same cultural icon as Bart at 10. Lisa at 38 has different cultural meaning than Lisa at 8. The specific mythology depends on the family remaining in the configuration that made the mythology legible in the first place. The youngish parents, the mischievous son, the brilliant daughter, the silent baby, the house, the couch, the town. Age would make them into a specific family at a specific moment in time. The floating timeline keeps them universal, keeps them always at the moment of their maximum relevance to the largest possible audience, keeps them available to each new generation of viewers as an entry point rather than as something that has to be encountered historically. We trap them there because we need them there. Because the version of the American family mythology that The Simpsons embodies is something we need to have access to, and having access to it requires that it not age into history. It has to stay in the present tense to maintain its function as a mirror. And Springfield keeps the mirror polished. Every episode, every Sunday night, every season, it shows us ourselves at the moment we most need to be seen. A family that fights and fails and resets and comes back to the couch together. A town that is clearly broken in ways it cannot acknowledge, but that keeps functioning anyway because functioning is what it has left. A world that does not make sense but that the people in it keep navigating because they do not have the option of stopping. We watch The Simpsons because Springfield is the place where everything is wrong and nobody knows it, and the family is still together, and the lights are still on, and the beer is still cold. We watch it because sometimes that is exactly the kind of place we need. The show will not end. Not because it has more stories to tell, because the story it has been telling is not the kind of story that ends. It is the kind of story that continues for as long as the need for it continues. And the need for a version of America that is broken but not defeated, contaminated but not gone, dreaming but somehow still holding on, that need does not appear to be going anywhere. Springfield keeps running because we keep watching. And we keep watching because Springfield keeps being there. The national contest that Fox ran around Who Shot Mr. Burns is, on reflection, one of the stranger promotional decisions in the history of American television, and not because of the contest itself. Contests tied to unresolved narrative cliffhangers were not unusual in 1995. The thing that makes this particular contest strange is what its outcome reveals about the relationship between the mystery's construction and its resolution. The contest's premise was specific. Fox told the public that the mystery was solvable from the clues embedded in Part 1. Not probably solvable, not solvable with some additional context, solvable. The clues were in the episode. A viewer who watched part 1 carefully enough and reasoned about the evidence correctly would be able to identify the shooter before part 2 aired. If this were true, a significant portion of the thousands of people who entered the contest should have identified Maggie Simpson. The clues, if they genuinely pointed toward Maggie, should have been identifiable by careful viewers. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some meaningful fraction of the thousands who entered and were presumably motivated enough to think about it seriously. According to the DVD commentary, essentially 0 people in the randomly selected pool got it right. There are a few ways to interpret this. One is that the clues were present but too subtle for a general audience to identify. The problem with this interpretation is that the contest was not asking sophisticated film students or professional puzzle solvers. It was asking the general television audience, and the prize was significant enough to motivate serious engagement from that audience. If the clues were present, and the exercise was one of careful reasoning, a large pool of careful reasoners should have produced at least some correct answers. Another interpretation is that the red herrings were so effective that they overwhelmed the actual clues. This is possible but carries its own problem. A well-constructed mystery uses red herrings to complicate the path to the correct answer, while still allowing the correct answer to be reached. If the red herrings are so effective that they entirely suppress the correct answer, the mystery is not functioning as advertised. It is functioning as misdirection rather than as a fair puzzle. The third interpretation, which the contest outcome makes most plausible, is that the mystery was not constructed to allow viewers to derive the correct answer from part 1. It was constructed to be unsolvable from part 1, in the sense that the correct answer was not determined when part 1 was written. The writers cycled through multiple candidates. Barney Gumble was the shooter in early drafts. Smithers was the shooter in an alternate ending that was fully animated. Maggie was the eventual answer, but the evidence suggests the answer was chosen after part 1 aired, rather than before it was written. If this is true, then the contest was fraudulent in a specific sense. Not fraudulent in the sense of intending to deceive anyone. Fraudulent in the sense of having been premised on a claim that was not accurate. The claim that the mystery was solvable from part 1 was not accurate if the answer had not been determined when part 1 was produced. The show's DVD commentary acknowledges this more honestly than most retrospective discussions of the episode do. The commentary notes that the writers found Maggie amusing as an answer and locked in on it, not that they had designed part 1 to point toward Maggie. The clue that the show treats as most significant, Burns's hands landing on W and S, was explicitly described by Burns himself as accidental. The eyelash and the DNA evidence pointed toward the Simpson family rather than toward Maggie specifically. The resolution required Burns to wake up and identify Maggie by name to close the gap. Burns's testimony from a man who had just been shot and spent an unspecified period in a coma is not unimpeachable. His account of what happened in the parking lot is the official resolution of the mystery. But coma patients emerging from unconsciousness with complete and accurate recall of events immediately preceding a traumatic injury is not a medically reliable state. And Burns, as a man who has spent significant time managing the cognitive effects of his own chronic condition, is not necessarily the most reliable narrator of his own experience in a moment of crisis. The contest nobody won is the conspiracy the show handed us openly, and which most discussions of the Burns shooting have absorbed without fully processing. The mystery was presented as fair. The evidence suggests it was not. The resolution was accepted as complete. The evidence suggests it was not. And the one person who got the answer right, using a college internet account that no longer exists, has never come forward to explain how they knew. The mystery of who shot Mr. Burns may be permanently unsolvable, not because the show hid the answer too well, but because the answer the show officially committed to was never as firmly established as the official resolution claims. There is a dimension of the Maggie question that connects her to the audience in a way that the other characters do not. Every theory about Maggie is ultimately a theory about watching, about what it means to observe something for a very long time without being able to act on what you observe, about the relationship between comprehensive understanding and the inability to translate that understanding into change, about the specific patience required to sit with what you know and wait for the moment when knowing it can become useful. This is the situation the audience is in with The Simpsons. We have been watching for 36 years. We have seen everything the show has depicted. We have absorbed the three-eyed fish, and the cracked cooling towers, and the bones in the basement, and the vote to exile Truth and Homer, surviving the thousandth impossible thing, and Burns glowing in the dark. We have processed all of it. We understand what it represents, at least some of us, at least when someone lays it out carefully. We know the theory, we have seen the evidence, and we keep watching. We do not do anything with what we know. We do not act on the implications. We sit in our chairs and we watch the loop run, and we find it comforting or entertaining or simply familiar in the way that long acquaintance produces a feeling that resembles comfort, even when the content does not justify it. We are Springfield, absorbing the information without processing it into action, because the action it would imply, which is stopping watching, is not available to us as a genuine option. We are too invested. We have been watching for too long. The show is part of the furniture of our lives in a way that removing it would register as a loss rather than a choice. We are inside the thing we are observing. We cannot step outside it to evaluate it from a neutral position because we are part of the system that maintains it. Maggie is the character in the show who most precisely mirrors this situation. She is inside Springfield watching Springfield. She understands what Springfield is better than anyone around her. She has the evidence and the analytical framework and the sustained patience that 36 years of careful observation produces. And she does not act. She waits. She catalogs. She stores what she knows for a moment she has decided has not arrived yet. The audience watches Maggie watch Springfield and does the same thing Maggie does. We understand more than we let on. We know things about this town that the town cannot know about itself. And we sit with that knowledge, episode after episode, because the alternative to sitting with it is to stop watching, and the alternative to watching is not something we are ready to choose. Maggie is the audience's mirror in the show. She is what it looks like from the inside when you know everything and choose, for reasons that make sense to you, not to act on it yet. The question of when Maggie will act is the same question as when the audience will decide it has had enough. Both questions remain open. Both are questions to which the answer has consistently been, not yet. His time is coming, but not yet. The specific legal implications of Springfield's unlocatability are worth tracing carefully, because they illuminate why the geographic ambiguity serves the people with the most to gain from it. Nuclear facilities in the United States operate under a layered regulatory framework. Federal agencies, including the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, have jurisdiction over safety standards, licensing, and operational requirements. State agencies have jurisdiction over environmental impacts within their state's boundaries. Local governments have jurisdiction over land use and public health implications within their territory. In practice, a nuclear plant's regulatory oversight involves coordination among federal, state, and local authorities, each with distinct areas of responsibility and distinct enforcement mechanisms. For a nuclear plant with 342 safety violations, each of these regulatory layers represents a potential avenue for intervention. The NRC could revoke operating licenses. The state EPA could take enforcement action on environmental violations. The local health department could investigate contamination effects on residents. Any one of these mechanisms, applied with reasonable diligence, would create serious problems for the plant's continued operation. For any of these mechanisms to be applied, the relevant regulatory authority needs to have clear jurisdiction. A state EPA can only act on violations occurring within its state. A local health department can only act on health effects within its jurisdiction. If Springfield's state is genuinely uncertain, if the facility could plausibly be in any of several states, the state with the clearest environmental violation has reduced certainty that the violation is within its jurisdiction. Regulatory action requires regulatory authority. Regulatory authority requires a jurisdictional claim. A jurisdictional claim requires a definite location. Springfield's geographic ambiguity is a perfect regulatory defense. Not because it actually removes the plant from any specific jurisdiction, but because it creates enough uncertainty that definitive jurisdictional claims are difficult to sustain. Enforcement action requires confidence in jurisdiction. Confidence in jurisdiction requires a location that does not change between episodes. Burns, who has been navigating regulatory environments for over a century and who employs legal counsel sophisticated enough to have kept a facility with hundreds of safety violations operating for decades, almost certainly understands this dynamic. The ambiguity may not have been engineered specifically as a regulatory defense, but it functions as one. And anything that functions as a regulatory defense for Burns's plant is something that Burns has an interest in maintaining. The show's deliberate production of geographic contradictions is not just an aesthetic choice or a universal design philosophy. It is, whether intentionally or through the accumulation of its own logic, a functional regulatory shield for the operation whose existence justifies the show's entire premise. The plant is the show's engine. The geographic ambiguity is one of the mechanisms that keeps the engine running. And the engine keeps running because no regulatory authority can definitively say whose problem it is. A final note on theories and why they matter. The theories in this breakdown are not presented as facts. The radiation theory is not confirmed by the show. The coma theory is denied by the show's creators, however incompletely. The collective denial framework is one reading of the principle and the pauper among several. Burns's immortality is an inference from scattered canonical details. The prediction phenomenon has a mundane statistical explanation that covers most of its cases. Mona's story is explicit in the show, but its conspiratorial implications are one way of reading what is explicit. What makes these theories worth spending 4 hours on is not whether they are true. It is what they allow you to see. Any sufficiently coherent theory about a sufficiently rich body of work does something interesting. It provides a frame. It gives you a way of organizing information that would otherwise remain scattered. It shows you connections between things that seemed isolated. It makes patterns visible that the noise of individual details tends to hide. The value of the theories in this breakdown is not their truth value. It is the way they organize 36 seasons of a show into a coherent picture that most individual episode analyses cannot produce. The radiation theory gives you a way of seeing the show's visual design not as artistic convention but as information. The yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the bulging eyes become data rather than style. The presence of those characteristics in some characters and not others becomes meaningful rather than incidental. The 3-eyed fish becomes the first data point in a series rather than a one-off gag. The theory does not need to be true for this reframing to be useful. The reframing is the value. The coma theory gives you a way of reading the show's tonal history not as a story of declining quality but as a record of changing conditions. The transition from the grounded early seasons to the surreal later ones stops being a mystery about what went wrong and becomes a coherent trajectory. The aging freeze stops being an unexplained convention and becomes a structurally motivated feature. The celebrity appearances stop being evidence of the show's desperation and become evidence of the dream's external inputs. Again, the theory does not need to be true for these reframings to be useful. The collective denial framework gives you a way of understanding the episodic reset, not as lazy writing, but as deliberate community behavior. Every time Springfield forgets a catastrophe, you are watching the principle and the pauper mechanism operating invisibly. Every time an implication is not drawn, you are watching the town vote. Every time the bones in the basement are not investigated, you are watching Springfield maintain the agreement. The framework does not need to be the correct explanation for this way of seeing to add something to how you watch the show. This is what theories do for us. Not confirm, not prove. They give us different ways of looking at the same thing, and different ways of looking at the same thing are among the most valuable tools available for understanding anything complex. The Simpsons is complex. It is 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes of a show that has been thinking about America carefully and continuously for as long as most of its current audience has been alive. It contains more carefully placed detail, more deliberately constructed implication, more deliberately buried possibility than any other show in American television history. It deserves to be engaged with on those terms. The theories are the engagement. They are the show's invitation, accepted. They are the evidence being taken seriously rather than absorbed as background noise. They are Springfield refusing to let you just watch. They are the question the show has been asking for 36 years, dressed in the clothes of a cartoon comedy, waiting for someone to notice it was a question. You are the person who noticed. Springfield thanks you. In its way. End of script. Total length, 40,000 plus words. What the show has always known. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. The longest-running scripted primetime show in American television history. And in all that time, across all those episodes, The Simpsons has been doing something that most of its audience has never quite noticed it doing. It has been watching us back. Not in a supernatural sense. Not in the sense of some design intention that anticipated who would be watching decades later. In the simpler and more profound sense that a show which depicts American life accurately enough, for long enough, with enough attention to the details that people tend not to examine, eventually becomes a document of the people watching it, as much as a document of the things it depicts. We are in The Simpsons, not as characters, as the audience, as the people who kept watching. As the community that press-paused a fictional family in 1989 and have been maintaining that pause for 36 years, because letting them age means admitting that we have aged too. Homer's inability to see the architecture of his own suffering is a portrait of something recognizable. Marge's endless patience and quietly enormous emotional labor is a portrait of something recognizable. Bart's rebellion against a system that offers him nothing better than what Homer has is a portrait of something recognizable. Lisa's frustration at being too smart for the environment she was born into is a portrait of something recognizable. Maggie's strategic silence in the face of an institution that would punish her for being what she is a portrait of something recognizable. The show does not flatter us by making these recognitions comfortable. It flatters us by trusting us to have them, by placing the recognition inside a comedy where we have enough distance from it to laugh, and then leaving the recognition there after the laugh has passed, undissolved, still present in the frame, still asking something of us. What it asks us is whether we are going to pretend we did not see it. Springfield's answer to that question is always yes. Always pretend. Always look away. Always vote to maintain the agreed version of events. Always tie the uncomfortable truth to a train and send it in a direction nobody specified. The audience's answer has been more interesting. The audience has, across 36 years, produced these theories, has paid attention, has noticed the bones in the basement and the glowing billionaire, and the crayon in the brain and the contest nobody won and the vote to exile truth, has taken the evidence seriously rather than absorbing it as texture, has asked what it means, has stayed up past midnight watching someone explain it. That is not Springfield's answer. That is a different answer. That is the answer of people who noticed the three-eyed fish and followed the implication rather than looking away. And The Simpsons, which has spent 36 years depicting a town full of people who look away, has been waiting for exactly those people. The people who would watch carefully enough to see the evidence, who would think carefully enough to assemble it, who would stay curious enough to ask what it means when a cartoon comedy has been quietly telling you the same thing for 36 years and everyone inside it has agreed not to notice. It means the show trusts you. It means it placed all of this there for someone. And you are the someone. Now go to sleep. Springfield will still be there when you wake up. It always is. Springfield is everywhere. There is a reason the show chose the name Springfield. Not just because Groening grew up near one. Because there is a Springfield in nearly every state. Because Springfield is the name that American communities reach for when they want a name that sounds like a town rather than a city, that sounds like a place where ordinary life happens rather than a place where history is made. Springfield is the American background. It is the setting of most of American life that does not make the news. The Springfield that The Simpsons depicts is a Springfield made of every Springfield. Made of every ordinary American community that has ever had a bad industrial neighbor and a powerful local employer, and a community that found it easier to not look than to look. Made of every community that has chosen stability over honesty when those two things came into conflict. Made of every family that has absorbed more than it probably should have and kept coming back to the table together because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. You have been to Springfield. Not this Springfield. Your Springfield. The one with the thing you were told not to worry about. The one with the employer who everyone complained about privately and never challenged publicly because the jobs. The one where you grew up knowing on some level that certain questions were not going to get honest answers, and learning, gradually, not to ask them. Every American who watches The Simpsons is watching their own town with the serial numbers filed off. This is why the show had to be geographically universal. Not because universality is aesthetically interesting, but because Springfield had to be able to be your town. It had to fit the geography of your specific experience of American ordinary. It could not be pinned to Oregon or Kentucky or anywhere else, because the moment it became a specific place, it stopped being every place, and it stopped being the place you know. The show is not set in Springfield, Oregon. It is set in wherever you grew up that had something wrong with it that nobody talked about. It is set in your hometown in the version where everything was basically fine as long as you did not look too hard at any specific thing for too long. It is set in the America you understand from the inside rather than the America that appears in the official record. That is why it has run for 36 years, because it is depicting a reality that continues to exist and that most depictions of American life are structured to conceal. The reality of a community that has developed, through the long accumulation of small choices, a comprehensive capacity to avoid the things it does not want to see. Springfield is everywhere, and The Simpsons is the mirror that the show has been holding up to everywhere for 3.5 decades, waiting for everyone inside the everywhere to decide what they are going to do about what they see. Most of them look away. You are still watching. That distinction matters more than the show will ever say out loud. Good night. The show that will not end. The Simpsons was renewed for a 37th and 38th season. At some point in the future, it will presumably be renewed for a 39th. The people who make it have said things that suggest they intend to continue making it for as long as anyone is willing to watch it. This is not a remarkable position for a successful television production to take. What is remarkable is that the show's premise and its specific mythology do not merely accommodate this indefinite continuation. They require it. A show about a family that does not age cannot end because ending it would require either having the family age, which is what ending a show about a family typically involves, or declaring that the show is simply stopping while the family continues to exist unchanged in some hypothetical off-screen Springfield. Neither option is satisfying. Neither option is what the show's premise was designed to deliver. The show was designed to run indefinitely. The floating timeline is not a feature that was added to allow the show to run indefinitely. It is the foundational design choice from which everything else follows. Homer and Marge did not have children who would grow up and eventually need their own shows, because that is not the mythology The Simpsons is sustaining. They have children who exist in a permanent childhood that will last as long as the show lasts, because the mythology requires the children to always be children and the family to always be intact. This is the specific shape of the story The Simpsons is telling. A story that does not progress. A story that cycles. A story that returns to the same house and the same couch and the same family configuration at the end of every episode regardless of what happened during it. A story that is structurally committed to never reaching its own conclusion. In literary terms, this is unusual. Stories are defined by their movement toward conclusions. The narrative arc, the character development, the resolution of central tensions, these are the building blocks of how stories work. A story with no arc, no development, and no resolution is not, by conventional definition, a story. It is something else. What it is something else of is a ritual. A repeated ceremony performed on a specific schedule, which produces not narrative meaning, but something closer to ritual meaning. The meaning that comes from the act of repetition itself. The meaning that comes from doing a thing correctly and completely in the established form on the scheduled occasion and finding the world unchanged at the end of it. The Simpsons is a television ritual. Every Sunday night, the family assembles on the couch. The town of Springfield does something. The family survives it. The family is still intact. Everyone goes home. The ceremony is performed. The world is confirmed to be as it was. The ritual meaning accumulates. This is why the show cannot end without a particular kind of loss that is different from the loss produced by the conclusion of a conventional narrative. When a conventional story ends, the ending is the point. The ending is where the story was going. The ending is where the accumulated meaning lands. When The Simpsons ends, there will be no landing point for the accumulated meaning. The accumulated meaning is in the repetition. It is in the decades of Sunday nights. It is in the specific quality of always being able to go back to Springfield and find it exactly as you left it. Ending the show would not conclude the ritual. It would terminate it. The meaning would not resolve into an ending. It would simply stop accumulating. And the decades of accumulated ritual meaning would remain, suspended, without the ongoing ceremony to sustain them. We will keep watching not because we need to know how the story ends. We will keep watching because the story has no end. Because the not ending is the story. Because every episode that runs and resets and returns the family to the couch is the show's answer to the question of what comes next. What comes next is this. Again, and again, and again. And that is enough. It has always been enough.